Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds impossible, surviving 3 straight months without seeing the sun. Not metaphorically, literally. So before we dive into this story of endurance, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up one morning and the sun doesn't rise. You wait. You check the time. Morning passes into what should be afternoon, but the darkness remains. Not the comfortable darkness of a cloudy day, but a deep, cold, absolute darkness that presses against your windows like something alive. Now imagine that darkness doesn't lift. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not for 3 entire months. This isn't science fiction. This is polar night, a natural phenomenon that occurs in the Arctic regions of Scandinavia, where the Vikings built some of their northernmost settlements. When winter arrives in places like northern Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, the sun doesn't just set early. It disappears completely, dropping below the horizon and refusing to return until the calendar says it's allowed. The Vikings who chose to live in these extreme northern territories knew what they were signing up for. Or at least, they thought they did. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it in your bones are two very different things. The first time you live through polar night, it changes you. The darkness becomes a presence, not an absence. It has weight. It has texture. And it absolutely has a psychological impact that modern humans, with their electric lights and heated homes, can barely comprehend. Let's start with what polar night actually looks like, because darkness isn't just darkness when you're living inside it for months. In the earliest weeks, there's still a hint of twilight around what would normally be midday. The horizon might glow with a deep blue or purple, a reminder that somewhere, beyond the curve of the earth, the sun still exists. This twilight period might last a few hours, giving just enough light to see your hand in front of your face, to navigate between buildings, to check on your animals without walking into a wall. But as the weeks progress, even that twilight fades. By the depth of winter, the darkness is total. The only light comes from the moon, when it's visible, from the stars scattered across the sky like salt spilled on black cloth, and from the occasional appearance of the aurora borealis. Those northern lights, dancing green and purple curtains of light across the sky, were both beautiful and unsettling to the Vikings. Some believed they were the spirits of unmarried women. Others thought they were reflections from the shields of the Valkyries as they rode across the sky, choosing who would die in battle. Either way, they were a reminder that even in total darkness, the world was never truly empty. The temperature during polar night wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in your lungs before you even exhale. The kind of cold where exposed skin develops frostbite in minutes. Where metal tools, if touched with bare hands, will freeze to your skin and tear away flesh when you pull away. In northern Scandinavia during the Viking Age, winter temperatures regularly dropped to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. And remember, this is before modern insulation, before synthetic fabrics, before central heating. The wind was perhaps worse than the cold itself. Arctic winds during polar night don't just blow. They attack. They search for every gap in your clothing, every crack in your walls, every weakness in your shelter. These winds can reach speeds that knock grown men off their feet, that pile snow into drifts higher than a longhouse roof, that make it impossible to venture outside without being disoriented within seconds. Snow during polar night falls differently than winter snow in temperate regions. Because it's so cold, the snow is dry, powdery, almost like sand. It doesn't pack well. It doesn't melt and refreeze into manageable ice. Instead, it blows endlessly, creating a landscape that shifts and changes overnight. A path cleared yesterday is buried today. Landmarks disappear under white blankets. The world becomes unrecognizable, alien, hostile. And yet, the Vikings lived here. Not just survived, but built communities, raised children, maintained culture. To understand how requires understanding not just their technology and techniques, but their mindset. These weren't people who saw nature as something to be conquered or controlled. They saw it as something to be respected, adapted to, and occasionally bargained with through offerings and prayers. The sea, which was the highway of Viking civilization during summer months, became a death trap during polar night. The water froze, but not always reliably. Sea ice in the Arctic is treacherous. It can look solid and collapse under your weight. It shifts with currents and winds, creating pressure ridges that crack and groan like the sounds of breaking bones. Vikings who relied on fishing and sea travel during summer had to completely change their survival strategies when the ocean became impassable. Animals responded to polar night in their own ways, and the Vikings watched these responses carefully. Seabirds disappeared, migrating south to warmer waters. Fish moved to deeper, slightly warmer waters where they were harder to catch. Reindeer and other land animals developed thick winter coats and changed their behavior, becoming more active during the brief twilight periods. The Vikings learned from these animals, adopting their strategies where possible. But perhaps the most disorienting aspect of polar night wasn't the cold or the darkness itself. It was the complete disruption of time. Humans are creatures of circadian rhythm. Our bodies expect the sun to rise and set, to mark the passage of days. Without this natural clock, time becomes fluid, unreliable. You lose track of whether you've been awake for hours or days. Sleep becomes irregular. Appetite changes. Your body doesn't know when it's supposed to be alert and when it's supposed to rest. The Vikings didn't have clocks in the modern sense. They told time by the sun's position, by the completion of tasks, by the natural rhythms of animals and plants. When all of these disappeared into darkness, they had to invent new ways of marking time. They counted sleeps, tracked moon phases when visible, and relied on internal estimation that was often wildly inaccurate. A day could feel like a week. A week could pass in what seemed like a day. Psychologically, this darkness did something to people that modern humans, even those living in high latitudes with electric lights, can barely imagine. Seasonal depression, now recognized as seasonal affective disorder, was a killer during Viking polar nights. Not because people understood it as a medical condition, but because the hopelessness it created led to real physical deterioration. People stopped eating properly, stopped taking care of themselves. In extreme cases, simply gave up. The Vikings called this condition by various names in their sagas and stories, though the exact translations are debated by scholars. Some sources suggest they recognized a winter sickness that made people weak and melancholy. Others indicate they simply saw it as a test of character, something that separated the strong from the weak. Either way, they developed strategies to combat it, which we'll explore in later segments. Storms during polar night were especially terrifying because you couldn't see them coming. In summer, you could watch storm clouds build on the horizon, see the darkening sky, make preparations. During polar night, a storm would simply arrive, announced only by the sudden increase in wind and the sound of snow battering against walls. These storms could last for days, making it impossible to leave shelter for any reason. If you weren't prepared with enough food, water, and fuel, you simply died. The snow accumulation created another problem: ventilation. Vikings built their homes low to the ground partly for warmth retention, but this made them vulnerable to being buried under snowdrifts. After a major storm, families sometimes had to dig themselves out from the inside, tunneling through snow that had piled against doors and covered roofs. If the ventilation holes for smoke became blocked, and they often did, carbon monoxide poisoning became a real danger. Navigation during polar night, even over familiar ground, became nearly impossible without landmarks. The Vikings developed techniques using ropes strung between buildings, allowing them to move from house to barn to storage shed without getting lost in their own settlement. These rope lines were essential. Stories exist of people becoming disoriented in blowing snow just meters from their home and freezing to death within sight of safety they couldn't see. The psychological pressure of being trapped indoors, in darkness, with the same people for months, cannot be overstated. Imagine being locked in a small, smoky room with your entire extended family, your in-laws, possibly some livestock, with no escape, no privacy, no break from the constant proximity of others. Tempers would fray. Arguments would escalate. Feuds that might have been manageable in summer, where people could separate and cool off, became explosive during polar night when there was nowhere to go. Yet the Vikings understood something profound about polar night that modern humans often forget. Darkness is not the enemy. Cold is not the enemy. These are simply conditions, like rain or wind or heat. The real enemy is fear. The enemy is giving up. The enemy is losing hope that the sun will ever return, even though it always has before. This is why Viking culture placed such enormous emphasis on stoicism, on mental toughness, on the ability to endure without complaint. These weren't just personality traits valued in warriors. They were survival necessities for every single person who lived through polar night. Your ability to maintain hope, to keep working, to stay mentally engaged even when every instinct screamed at you to give up. This determined whether you lived or died. The Vikings who thrived in these conditions weren't necessarily the strongest physically. They were the ones who could maintain routine when time became meaningless, who could find purpose when everything was dark, who could create light, both literal and metaphorical, in the middle of absolute darkness. They were the ones who understood that surviving polar night wasn't about fighting the darkness. It was about learning to live inside it, to make it your home rather than your prison. And this brings us to the most important truth about polar night survival. The darkness outside was survivable. Every Viking who made it through polar night did so because they learned to manage the darkness inside, the fear, the despair, the creeping sense that this darkness might be permanent. The external conditions were brutal, yes, but the internal battle was where survival was actually won or lost. The Vikings didn't stumble into polar night territory by accident. They sailed there deliberately, driven by a complex mix of curiosity, desperation, and the kind of stubborn determination that makes you think, everyone says this land will kill me, so naturally I must live there. But choosing to settle in these extreme northern regions meant more than just showing up with a boat and an optimistic attitude. It meant understanding architecture, community planning, and survival logistics in ways that would make modern engineers nod with respect. Let's start with the settlements themselves. The northernmost Viking settlements, places like Tromsø in northern Norway, various locations across Iceland, and the genuinely insane settlements in Greenland, weren't cities in any modern sense. They were clusters of farmsteads, scattered across the landscape wherever the land offered some marginal advantage. A stream that didn't freeze completely, a hillside sheltered from the worst winds, a patch of ground where grass could grow during the brief summer, providing fodder for animals. These weren't random locations chosen on a whim. The Vikings who established these settlements were careful observers of nature. They looked for what they called good land, which didn't mean fertile in the agricultural sense that farmers in southern Europe would recognize. It meant land that offered some combination of shelter, water access, and potential for survival. They watched where snow accumulated versus where it blew clear. They noted which slopes got any sun at all during winter. They observed where wild animals gathered, understanding that if reindeer could survive there, so could livestock with proper care. The centerpiece of any Viking settlement was the longhouse, but longhouses in polar regions were different from their counterparts in southern Scandinavia. These were buildings designed not for summer comfort, but for winter survival. The basic structure remained similar, a long rectangular building with slightly curved walls, but every detail was modified for extreme cold. The walls were thick. Not just thick, but massively thick, sometimes approaching a meter in width. These walls weren't just wood or just stone. They were composite structures, layers of different materials working together. The outer layer might be turf, cut in blocks and stacked like bricks. Turf is an excellent insulator because it's essentially grass and soil, full of air pockets that trap heat. It's also renewable. When it started to decay, you could replace sections without rebuilding the entire structure. Behind the turf came a layer of whatever was available. In areas with trees, wooden planks provided structure. In treeless Iceland and Greenland, it was stone, carefully fitted together. Then came another insulation layer, moss collected from bogs and stuffed into every gap, or dried seaweed in coastal areas, or even packed snow in the depths of winter, creating an ironic situation where snow outside your walls helped keep you warm inside them. The roof was crucial. In southern Scandinavia, longhouses often had thatched roofs made from straw or reeds. In polar regions, thatch wouldn't survive the wind and weight of snow accumulation. Instead, these northern longhouses had turf roofs, thick layers of soil and grass supported by wooden beams. These roofs were heavy, putting tremendous stress on the walls and internal supports. but they provided insulation that thatched roofs couldn't match. A turf roof required maintenance that would seem bizarre to modern homeowners. During summer, the grass on the roof would grow, and it actually needed to be grazed. Some settlements used sheep, literally putting livestock on the roof to keep the grass trimmed. If the grass got too long, it would die and rot, compromising the insulation. If it was grazed too short, the roots would dry out and the soil would blow away. Managing your roof was a delicate balance of ecological engineering. The entrance to these longhouses was never just a simple door. It was a tunnel, sometimes several meters long, dug down into the earth and lined with stone or wood. This tunnel served multiple purposes. First, it was a wind barrier. The wind couldn't blow directly into the house. Second, it was a cold trap. Cold air would sink into the tunnel rather than flowing into the main living area. Third, it was a snow defense. When snow piled up against the entrance, which it always did, the tunnel meant you could dig out without having to excavate your entire doorway. Some northern longhouses had two entrances at opposite ends, allowing for ventilation during summer and providing an emergency exit if one entrance became blocked. But during polar night, one entrance would be deliberately blocked from the inside with snow, turf, and whatever else was available, leaving only one way in or out. This reduced drafts and heat loss, though it also meant you were effectively sealing yourself into your home for months. Inside the longhouse, the layout was dictated by heat management. The fire pit, which we'll discuss in detail in the next segment, was positioned in the center, with sleeping platforms along the walls raised about half a meter off the ground. This wasn't for status or comfort. It was physics. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. By sleeping on raised platforms, Vikings positioned themselves in the warmest zone of the house. The floor itself was usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with layers of straw or rushes that could be replaced periodically. These floor coverings served as insulation from the cold ground and as primitive sewage management, absorbing spills and waste until they could be removed and replaced. Archaeological excavations of Viking longhouses have found these floor layers built up over years, creating a chronological record of daily life that's both fascinating and pungent to modern researchers. Storage was built into the walls. Niches carved into the turf walls held food, tools, and personal items. Larger storage areas, essentially closets without doors, housed the preserved food that would get a family through winter. These storage niches were strategically positioned near the fire for items that needed to stay above freezing, far from the fire for items that needed to stay cold. But a longhouse wasn't freestanding. Each longhouse was part of a compound that included multiple structures. There was always a storehouse, a separate building for food storage, positioned away from the main house to reduce fire risk and to keep food cold. There was a barn or byre for livestock, though as mentioned in earlier content, the line between human and animal quarters often blurred during the coldest nights. Some settlements had a separate bathhouse or sweat lodge, a smaller structure used for bathing and, as discussed in Viking winter survival techniques, for the hot-cold therapy that Vikings believed promoted health. These bathhouses were used even during polar night, though getting from the longhouse to the bathhouse required careful preparation and usually involved multiple people to ensure no one got lost in the darkness. The settlement layout itself followed logic that modern urban planners would recognize. Buildings were positioned to shelter each other from prevailing winds. Pathways between structures were clearly defined and, as mentioned, often marked with rope lines during winter. The community's wells or water sources were centrally located so no household was too far from water, crucial when a trip to the well was a dangerous expedition during a storm. These settlements were never large by modern standards. A major Viking settlement in polar regions might have 10 to 15 households, perhaps 50 to 100 people total. This wasn't due to lack of ambition. It was cold mathematical reality. The land could only support so many people. Each household needed grazing land for animals during summer, access to fishing or hunting grounds, and space to gather the fuel, fodder, and food that would get them through winter. Community spacing also reflected another reality: smell. With limited bathing, indoor livestock, and sanitation that amounted to chamber pots emptied into pits, these settlements weren't fragrant. Having some distance between households wasn't just about land use. It was about making life marginally more tolerable. The settlement itself needed defenses, not against human raiders, that was a summer concern, but against winter threats. Fences and walls kept livestock from wandering and protected against wolves and polar bears, both of which became bolder during the dark months. These weren't elaborate fortifications, just practical barriers made from whatever materials were available: stone, turf, or driftwood in coastal areas. Water access was perhaps the greatest challenge. During polar night, liquid water wasn't something you could take for granted. Streams froze. Wells froze. Even the sea ice offered no easy water because sea water is salty and sea ice only gradually becomes fresh as salt separates out. Vikings in these settlements had to actively plan for water, melting snow and ice over fires, a process that consumed tremendous amounts of fuel and provided relatively little water. Some ingenious Viking settlements built entire structures dedicated to snow melting. A small shed with a large metal or stone vessel permanently positioned over a fire pit. Snow would be shoveled in constantly, producing a trickle of meltwater that was collected and rationed. This was communal infrastructure, managed by the settlement as a whole, because no individual household could afford to dedicate that much fuel to water production alone. The treeless landscapes of Iceland and Greenland presented unique challenges. Without wood, Vikings had to improvise. Driftwood, carried by ocean currents from Siberian forests, was precious beyond measure. A good piece of driftwood was as valuable as metal. Settlers combed beaches constantly during summer, collecting and hoarding every piece they could find. Whalebone became structural material, used for roof supports and door frames. Turf became even more important as the primary building material for walls. In Greenland particularly, the Viking settlements represent perhaps the most extreme example of human determination to live where humans probably shouldn't. The Greenland Viking communities, established in the late 10th century, survived for about 500 years before finally being abandoned, likely due to a combination of climate cooling, resource depletion, and isolation. But for those 5 centuries, people lived, worked, raised families, and maintained Norse culture in one of the harshest environments on Earth. These Greenland settlements showed remarkable sophistication. Archaeological evidence reveals longhouses with walls over a meter thick, intricate drainage systems to manage summer snowmelt, and storage facilities carved into permafrost, creating natural freezers that required no maintenance. The Greenlanders developed their own pottery styles, iron-working techniques adapted to limited fuel supplies, and textile production methods that maximized every thread. But all of this infrastructure, all of this careful planning and engineering, was just the foundation. The physical structures kept out the worst of the wind and cold. They trapped heat and provided workspace. But surviving polar night required more than walls and roofs. It required fire, the center of all life. And that's where our story continues. In the world of polar night, fire wasn't just useful. It wasn't just important. Fire was the line between life and death, between human and animal, between civilization and chaos. Every other survival technology, every technique, every adaptation, all of it was secondary to this single essential truth. You must keep the fire burning. The central hearth of a Viking longhouse in polar regions was never allowed to go out during winter. Never. Not for cleaning, not for repairs, not for any reason. From the first day of polar night until the sun returned, that fire burned continuously. Because restarting a fire in extreme cold, in darkness, with frozen hands and limited dry tinder, was difficult even for experienced Vikings. And if the fire went out completely, if the house cooled down, if cold truly penetrated the structure, you might not have the strength or coordination to start it again. This created an immediate and obvious problem. How do you keep a fire burning for 3 months? The fuel requirements were staggering. A single longhouse fire might consume an entire tree's worth of wood in a single week of cold weather. Multiply that by 12 weeks, by multiple households in a settlement, and you begin to understand the scale of the challenge. Let's start with fuel. In areas with forests, timber was the obvious choice, but even there, it required year-round planning. Summer and early fall were dedicated to logging. Trees were cut, split, and stacked to dry for the following winter. Greenwood doesn't burn well, producing more smoke than heat, so it needed at least 1 full year of drying before it was truly useful. This meant Vikings needed to think 2 winters ahead. The wood you cut this summer wouldn't be used until next winter. The wood burning this winter was cut last year. But many Viking settlements in polar regions had no trees. Iceland's forests were small and quickly depleted. Greenland had none at all. In these places, Vikings adapted to alternative fuels, and this is where their resourcefulness becomes truly impressive. Peat was the primary alternative. Peat is partially decomposed plant matter found in bogs, and Scandinavia, Iceland, and parts of Greenland have extensive peat deposits. Dried peat burns slowly and steadily, producing good heat, though it creates a distinctive, musty smoke that permeated everything. Harvesting peat was labor-intensive. It had to be cut from bogs in brick-sized blocks, then dried for months before it could be burned. Like wood, peat required advanced planning and storage. The Vikings became experts at peat management. They developed cutting tools specifically designed for peat extraction. They built drying sheds with ventilation that maximized drying during summer. They learned which bogs produced the best peat, which layers burned hottest, which could be used immediately, and which needed longer drying. This knowledge was passed down through generations and was as important as any other survival skill. But in the depths of winter, when stored peat ran low and wood was exhausted, Vikings turned to fuel sources that modern people find disturbing: animal fat and bone. Every scrap of fat from butchered animals was saved. Whale blubber, when available from coastal hunting, was precious beyond measure. This fat was rendered down and either burned directly in oil lamps or mixed with other fuels to extend their burn time. Bone, especially from marine mammals and cattle, could be burned, though it required a hot fire to ignite and produced an acrid smoke. But when you're cold enough, when your children are shivering and your elderly are showing signs of hypothermia, you burn what you have. Viking archaeological sites show fire pits with layers of charred bone mixed with peat and wood, silent testimony to fuel shortages and desperate measures. Seal oil was particularly valuable in coastal settlements. It burned cleanly in lamps, produced minimal smoke, and was relatively easy to store. A seal oil lamp isn't much to look at, just a shallow stone or ceramic bowl filled with oil with a wick made from moss or twisted plant fibers. But a handful of these lamps could provide light and supplementary heat for an entire longhouse. They couldn't replace the central fire, but they reduced its burden. Managing the fire itself was a full-time responsibility. In each household, someone was always designated as fire tender, usually rotating through family members. The fire tender's job was to monitor the fire constantly, adding fuel as needed, adjusting airflow to maintain optimal burning, and ensuring the fire never died to coals so low that it couldn't be revived. This sounds simple until you consider the variables. Add too much fuel at once, and you smother the fire or create so much heat that it's uncomfortable. Add too little, and the fire weakens to the point where it can't catch new fuel. Different fuels require different techniques. Wood needs air circulation. Peat needs to be placed carefully on hot coals. Fat needs to be introduced slowly, or it will flare dangerously. The fire tender also managed smoke, which was both blessing and curse. Smoke from the central fire rose toward the roof, where it eventually found its way out through carefully positioned vents. But as discussed in the Viking survival content, smoke control was imperfect. Too much smoke made the house unlivable. Too little smoke meant you weren't burning enough fuel to stay warm. The balance was delicate and required constant attention. During storms, when wind could blow down through smoke holes and scatter embers, or when snow could block vents entirely, fire management became crisis management. The fire tender might need to physically block vents with turf or cloth to prevent snow infiltration while ensuring enough ventilation remained that carbon monoxide didn't accumulate. This required judgment gained through experience, and mistakes could be fatal. Starting a fire from scratch, when necessary, was done using multiple methods. The most common was the strike-a-light method, using a piece of steel or iron struck against flint to create sparks. These sparks would be caught on tinder, usually dried moss, charred cloth, or fungi specially prepared to catch sparks easily. The tinder would be gently blown into flame, then transferred to larger kindling, then to fuel. This process sounds straightforward but requires practice and patience. In extreme cold, your hands shake. Metal becomes painful to touch. Finding dry tinder when everything is covered in snow requires planning. Hence, Vikings kept emergency tinder in sealed containers near the fire, rotated regularly to ensure it stayed dry. The other method was friction fire, using a bow drill or hand drill to create enough friction to generate an ember in a piece of wood. This required specific wood types, dry conditions, and significant physical effort. It was slower than Strike-A-Light and usually used only as backup or for ceremonial purposes. But the technology of making fire was only half the battle. The other half was psychological. The fire was the center of life in ways that went beyond physical warmth. The fire was where food was cooked, where people gathered, where stories were told. The firelight pushing back the darkness wasn't just practical illumination. It was hope made visible. Vikings understood this symbolically. Their word for family, roughly translated, includes concepts of hearth and fire. To belong to a hearth was to belong to a family. When couples married, a ceremonial fire was lit, and both families contributed fuel, symbolizing the joining of two hearth groups into one. When someone died, their portion of hearthright died with them, sometimes literally marked by removing a log from the communal fire pile. During polar night, the fire took on even deeper meaning. In Norse mythology, fire was associated with the realm of Muspelheim, one of the 9 worlds, a place of heat and light standing in opposition to Niflheim, the realm of ice and darkness. During polar night, when darkness seemed absolute, the fire in your longhouse wasn't just physics. It was a piece of Muspelheim brought into the mortal world, a weapon against the primordial cold. Religious offerings were sometimes made to the fire itself. A portion of valuable fuel, a splash of mead, a piece of the first bread baked. These weren't offerings to God so much as acknowledgments of the fire's importance, treating it almost as a living member of the household that needed to be fed and respected. Children were taught fire management from the earliest age. A child old enough to walk could fetch small pieces of kindling. A child old enough to follow instructions could tend the fire under supervision. By the time a Viking child reached adolescence, they were expected to be fully competent at all aspects of fire management. This wasn't optional education. It was survival training. The social structure of the longhouse reflected the fire's centrality. The position closest to the fire was reserved for the household head and their immediate family. Other family members had positions further from the fire based on status and need. Elderly and very young, who needed warmth most, were closer. Young, healthy adults who could tolerate more cold were further away. This wasn't cruelty. It was careful management of limited heat. Visitors to a longhouse, and there were visitors even during polar night, neighbors checking on each other, traders who'd arrived before winter and couldn't leave, were given positions according to their status. An honored guest sat near the fire. A slave or low-status person sat in the coldest areas. Your distance from the fire was a visible marker of your social position. The fire also served industrial purposes beyond heat and cooking. Metal tools were sharpened and repaired by heating in the fire, though working metal required temperatures higher than a normal hearth could provide, often necessitating a separate forge fire with forced air from bellows. Hide and leather were softened and worked near the fire's heat. Some food preservation, smoking meat and fish, happened in the rafters above the fire where smoke naturally accumulated. At night, the fire was banked, carefully arranged to burn slowly through sleep hours without constant tending. A large piece of fuel, ideally a log in wood-burning areas or a large block of peat, would be placed on the existing coals, surrounded by ash to restrict airflow and slow combustion. A properly banked fire could burn unattended for 6 to 8 hours, enough for a night's sleep. But banking a fire wrong could mean waking to ashes and facing the dreaded process of restarting in the dark and cold. The constant burning fire meant that longhouses were never truly cold, but they were never uniformly warm either. Near the fire, temperatures might reach comfortable levels. A meter away, it might be cool. Against the walls, it could be only marginally warmer than outside. This created microclimates within the longhouse. You learned where the warm spots were and competed for them. Fire safety was a constant concern. With an open fire burning continuously in a structure made from wood, turf, and other flammable materials, the risk of devastating fire was real. Stories in the sagas mention entire settlements burning when one longhouse fire got out of control. Vikings managed this risk through careful fire pit construction, positioning the pit in a stone or clay-lined depression with nothing flammable directly above. Embers that popped out of the fire were immediately swept back. Water or snow was always kept nearby for emergencies. Yet despite all precautions, fires happened. When a longhouse burned during polar night, it was catastrophic not just because of the structure loss, but because replacing it was impossible. You couldn't rebuild in darkness and extreme cold. Families who lost their homes had to crowd into neighbors' longhouses or, in some tragic cases, face the dark and cold without adequate shelter. This brings us full circle to the opening truth. The fire was life. Everything else in Viking polar night survival, the food storage, the clothing, the community structure, all of it was built around keeping that fire burning. As long as the fire lasted, hope lasted. The moment the fire died, survival became exponentially harder. And so the fire tender watched through the long dark hours, adding fuel, adjusting, maintaining the small sphere of heat and light that stood between their family and the absolute cold outside. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the most important work in the world. When you can't go outside for 3 months, when farming is impossible and hunting is deadly, when the sea is frozen and the land is buried under snow, the question of food becomes literally a matter of life or death. The Vikings who settled in polar regions weren't flying blind. They brought with them centuries of accumulated knowledge about food preservation, storage, and rationing. But polar night pushed these techniques to their absolute limits. Let's start with the basic math because it's sobering. An adult human needs roughly 2,000 calories per day to maintain body weight under normal conditions. In extreme cold, that number increases. Your body burns calories constantly just to maintain core temperature. Add physical labor, and the requirement climbs higher still. A working adult Viking during polar night might need 3,000 calories or more per day. Now multiply that by every person in a household. A typical longhouse might have 8 to 12 people. That's 24 to 36,000 calories per day. Over 3 months, we're talking about 2 to 3 million calories that need to be stored, protected, and rationed. And that's for one household. A settlement of 10 households needed 20 to 30 million calories ready before polar night began. This is why summer in Viking polar settlements was frantic. Every day of summer weather was a day to gather food. Every fish caught, every animal hunted, every plant harvested was literal winter survival. There was no leisure, no casual relaxation. You worked every hour of daylight because winter's debt collector was coming and payment was non-negotiable. Fish was the foundation of the polar night diet for coastal settlements. Cod, herring, salmon, whatever was available was caught in massive quantities during summer. But fresh fish spoils within days, so preservation was essential. The Vikings mastered multiple preservation techniques, each suited to different fish types and storage conditions. Drying was the most common method. Fish were gutted, split open, and hung on racks in the open air. The cold Arctic wind and low humidity slowly desiccated the fish, removing moisture that bacteria need to grow. Properly dried fish, called stockfish, became hard as wood and could last for years. Stockfish was so durable it was a trade good, exported from Norway to other parts of Europe. To eat it, you soaked it in water for days to rehydrate, then boiled or baked it. Salting was used for fattier fish that didn't dry well. Salt, which had to be either mined or produced by evaporating seawater, was precious, but a little went a long way. Fish packed in salt would cure, the salt drawing out moisture and creating an environment inhospitable to bacteria. Salted fish kept for months and, like stockfish, required soaking before cooking. Then there was fermentation, and this is where things get interesting for modern palates. The Vikings developed fermented fish products that would seem bizarre or disgusting to most people today, but which were nutritionally brilliant. Rackfisk, fermented fish buried in brine, developed strong flavors and smells, but remained edible for extended periods. The fermentation process actually created vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which was otherwise scarce in a diet heavy on preserved meat and fish. Lutefisk, mentioned in earlier content, is fish soaked in lye until it becomes jelly-like. While its origins might be later than the main Viking age, similar techniques using wood ash or other alkaline substances were used to preserve and prepare fish. These methods changed the protein structure, making it unappetizing to bacteria while remaining digestible for humans, even if barely. Meat preservation followed similar principles. Animals slaughtered in late fall, after they'd fattened on summer grazing, were processed immediately. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. The prime cuts were salted or smoked. Smoking involved hanging meat in the rafters above the longhouse fire, where constant smoke from peat or wood slowly cured it. This wasn't fast. Good smoked meat required weeks of exposure to create the hard, dark exterior that sealed in what moisture remained. Organ meats, which spoil faster than muscle, were often eaten immediately or made into sausages. Blood was mixed with fat, grain, and spices to create blood sausage, a dense, calorie-rich food that could be smoked or dried. The Vikings wasted nothing. Intestines became sausage casings. Stomachs became storage bags. Bones were saved for burning as fuel or boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of marrow and flavor. Fat was perhaps the most valuable product of all. Animal fat, especially from seals, whales, or well-fed cattle, was rendered down and stored in sealed containers. Fat doesn't just preserve well. It's calorie-dense, providing 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein or carbohydrates. During polar night, when every calorie counted, fat was literally life-saving. It was eaten directly, spread on bread, added to stews, or burned as fuel when other options ran out. Dairy products were crucial but challenging. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk, but only during certain seasons, and keeping livestock healthy enough to produce milk during polar night was difficult. Most dairy was preserved during summer for winter consumption. Cheese was the primary preservation method. Viking cheese wasn't the soft, creamy varieties we might enjoy today. It was hard, salty, almost rock-like cheese that could last months or even years. Butter was salted and packed into barrels or sealed in animal bladders. Some butter was buried in peat bogs, where the cold and acidic environment preserved it. Archaeological discoveries have found Viking-era butter buried in Irish bogs, still preserved 1,000 years later, though nobody has been brave enough to taste it. Skyr, that yogurt-like dairy product mentioned in earlier content, was another preservation method. The fermentation process that creates skyr makes it acidic enough that harmful bacteria struggle to grow. It was high in protein, tangy, and filling. Mixed with whatever else was available, berries preserved in fat, a bit of honey if you were wealthy, it provided variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. Grains were the backbone of caloric intake. Barley and rye could be stored for years if kept dry and protected from rodents. Vikings built specialized storage buildings with raised floors to keep grain away from ground moisture and make it harder for mice to access. These granaries were often lined with stone and had minimal ventilation to keep moisture out while preventing condensation. The grain was ground into flour as needed using hand-operated corn stones, 2 circular stones that ground grain between them. This was labor-intensive work, usually done by women and children, and it produced flour that by modern standards would seem coarse and full of stone grit. But it made bread, and bread was life. Viking bread during polar night was dense and dark. The flour often included ground peas or beans to extend it. Sometimes tree bark, ground into flour, was added. This isn't as horrific as it sounds. The inner bark of pine or birch trees contains nutrients and was used in Scandinavian bread making into the 20th century during famines. It made the bread bitter and difficult to digest, but it filled stomachs and provided calories. Porridge was perhaps more common than bread because it required less fuel to make. Oats or barley boiled in water or milk, maybe with some preserved berries or a bit of fat for flavor, created a warm, filling meal that could be stretched to feed many people. The porridge pot hung over the fire might simmer continuously, with new grain and water added as portions were removed, creating an ever-evolving stew that was never quite the same twice. Vegetables and fruits from summer were preserved through multiple methods. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions, could be stored in cold cellars dug into permafrost or buried in sand. Berries were dried or preserved in fat or honey. Apples, in areas where they grew, were dried or stored in cool, dark places. Herbs and greens were dried and used to flavor food and as medicine. Mushrooms were dried and provided both flavor and some nutritional value during winter. Vikings knew which mushrooms were safe and which were deadly, knowledge passed down through generations. Some mushrooms were even mildly psychoactive and might have been used in small amounts during religious rituals, though evidence for this is debated among scholars. But here's the thing about all this preserved food. It was nutritionally incomplete. Preserved meat and fish lose vitamin C during processing. Grains lack certain amino acids. The Viking polar night diet was heavy on calories, particularly from fat, but often deficient in vitamins that fresh food provides. This led to health problems that Vikings recognized even if they didn't understand them in modern terms. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a real threat. The fermented fish and dairy products provided some vitamin C, and Vikings also made teas from pine needles, which contain vitamin C, though they didn't know why this helped. They just knew from observation that people who drank pine needle tea stayed healthier during winter. Anemia from iron deficiency was common, particularly among women and children. Blood-based foods helped, as did organ meats, but the diet overall wasn't optimal. Archaeological evidence from Viking remains shows signs of nutritional stress, particularly in individuals from northern settlements. Food storage required constant vigilance. Even preserved food could spoil if storage conditions weren't right. Too much moisture and dried fish would mold. Too much heat and salted meat would rot. Storage areas needed to be cold but not freezing, dry but not desiccated, dark to prevent light degradation, and secure from pests. Rodents were a constant problem. Mice and rats could devastate winter food supplies. Vikings used cats, valued as working animals for pest control, and built storage containers for materials rodents couldn't easily chew through: ceramic, metal, or very hard wood. Grain storage buildings sometimes had foundations designed to prevent rodent access, with smooth stone or metal barriers that mice couldn't climb. Food rationing was essential and required discipline that's hard for modern people to imagine. You couldn't just eat when you were hungry. You had to eat on a schedule calculated to make supplies last. This rationing was managed by the household head, usually the senior man or woman, who decided portion sizes and meal frequency. Early in polar night, when supplies were freshest and most abundant, portions might be generous. As winter progressed and supplies dwindled, portions shrunk. The last month of polar night was often the hardest because food was running lowest, but the cold remained extreme. This late winter period, sometimes called the hungry time, was when malnutrition and starvation were most likely. Meals during polar night followed a pattern dictated by both tradition and practicality. There were typically two main meals. One in what would be morning, after waking, providing energy for the day's indoor work. Another in evening, allowing people to warm up before sleep. Depending on supplies, there might be a light midday meal, but this wasn't guaranteed. The evening meal was the social center of the day. This was when the household gathered around the fire, when food was shared, when stories were told. The food itself might be simple: stew, porridge, dried fish soaked and baked, bread if grain was plentiful. But the ritual of eating together, of sharing whatever was available, was crucial for maintaining morale. Alcohol played a significant role in polar night diet, not just for morale, but for calories and preservation. Beer, made from barley or other grains, was weak by modern standards, but provided both hydration. Water quality was often poor, and calories. Mead, made from fermented honey, was more precious and usually reserved for special occasions or used medicinally. These alcoholic drinks were food as much as beverage. They contained calories from the sugars and grains used to make them, and the fermentation process preserved them indefinitely. A household with a good supply of beer and mead had both nutrition and a powerful tool for maintaining sanity during the long dark months. Honey itself was incredibly valuable. Vikings kept bees during summer, harvesting honey that wouldn't ferment if stored properly. Honey was medicine, treating wounds and sore throats. It was preservative, mixed with berries or other foods. It was trade goods and luxury food. A household wealthy enough to have honey was wealthy indeed. Water management during polar night was its own challenge, related to food preparation. As mentioned earlier, liquid water wasn't freely available. Every drop had to be melted from snow or ice, requiring fuel and time. This meant water conservation was crucial. Cooking water was reused multiple times. Stew liquid from one meal became the base for the next. Washing dishes was done minimally, and water from washing might be given to animals rather than simply discarded. Food preparation during polar night was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Dried fish needed to be soaked for days. Grain needed to be ground. Everything needed to be cooked over the fire, which had to be maintained regardless. The person responsible for cooking, usually women but sometimes shared among household members, was working constantly. Children learned food preparation skills from the earliest age. A young child could stir porridge, watch for boiling over, fetch ingredients from storage. Older children could grind grain, prepare fish, knead bread. By the time a child reached adolescence, they knew every aspect of food preservation and preparation. This knowledge was survival, literally the difference between living and dying. Special occasions during polar night warranted special foods. During Yule, which we'll discuss in detail later, preserved meats might be cooked in ways that required more fuel, roasted instead of boiled. Precious stores of honey might be used to sweeten bread or make special drinks. These feasts weren't just celebration. They were psychological necessity, breaking the monotony and giving people something to anticipate. But even during feasts, waste was never acceptable. Every scrap was eaten or saved. Bones were boiled for broth, then burned for fuel. Vegetable trimmings went into stew or to animals. The idea of throwing away food would have been incomprehensible to Vikings living through polar night. Food was too valuable, too hard-won, too essential. The social dynamics around food distribution were complex. The household head controlled distribution, but fairness was expected. Favoring one person over another, giving larger portions to favorites or smaller portions to those out of favor, could destroy household harmony. In a situation where everyone was trapped together for months, unfair food distribution could lead to feuds, violence, or even murder. There are saga references to households splitting apart during winter due to disputes over food. In extreme cases, individuals would be expelled from a household, forced out into the darkness and cold. This was effectively a death sentence, and it happened when someone violated the social compact of fair distribution and mutual support. Conversely, generosity with food, particularly toward those who were struggling, built social capital. A household that shared when neighbors were desperate earned respect and future reciprocity. The Vikings understood that winter was long and fortunes could change. The neighbor you helped this year might be the one who helped you next year. Food also played a role in maintaining hierarchy and status. High-status individuals received choice portions, the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread. But this wasn't purely selfish. Leaders were expected to eat well to maintain the strength needed for decision-making and to demonstrate that the household or community was prosperous. A leader who looked starved or weak undermined confidence. Slaves and low-status individuals received less food and lower quality, but they still received enough to work. A starved slave couldn't perform labor, and Vikings, pragmatic above all, understood this. Slavery in Viking society was complex and brutal, but slave survival during winter was economically necessary. As polar night progressed and spring approached, the psychological challenge of food management intensified. Supplies dwindled. Variety disappeared. The last months might be nothing but the most basic preserved foods, eaten in small portions, supplemented by whatever could be hunted on rare ventures outside. The sight of storage containers emptying must have been terrifying. Vikings coped by focusing on the inevitable truth that spring would come. The sun would return. The ice would melt. Fishing and hunting would resume. Fresh food would become available. This hope, this certainty based on centuries of experience, kept people going even as their bellies growled and their bodies weakened from nutritional deficiency. And when the sun finally did return, when the first fresh fish could be caught or the first seal could be hunted, the relief must have been indescribable. Fresh meat after months of preserved. Fresh blood, which Vikings drank for its nutritional value. Fresh anything after endless preserved monotony. These first tastes of spring were celebrated with a gratitude that modern people, who can walk to a supermarket anytime, can barely understand. The food management strategies that allowed Vikings to survive polar night weren't just practical techniques. They were cultural values deeply embedded in Norse society. Waste was sin. Preparation was virtue. Sharing was obligation. These values, forged in the necessity of surviving absolute darkness and cold, became part of Viking identity and were carried even into places and times where survival wasn't quite so desperate. Here's a truth that surprises modern people. Vikings during polar night weren't hibernating. They weren't sitting around doing nothing for 3 months. In fact, Polar night was one of the most productive times of year, just in different ways than summer. While the darkness and cold made outdoor work impossible, indoor work intensified. The same darkness that prevented farming created time for crafts, maintenance, and cultural activities that kept both hands and minds occupied. Let's start with the most essential work, textile production. Clothing was literally survival equipment in polar regions, and it wore out constantly. Wool garments exposed to friction, moisture from snow, and the general abuse of daily life developed holes and weak spots. Thread unraveled. Seams split. Without constant maintenance and production of new garments, you'd eventually find yourself naked in sub-zero temperatures, which would end your story quickly. Spinning was constant. Sheep were sheared in summer, producing massive amounts of raw wool. This wool needed to be cleaned, carded to align the fibers, and spun into thread. Spinning was done using a drop spindle, a simple tool that's essentially a stick with a weight on it. You draft fibers from a mass of wool, twist them into thread using the spindle's rotation, and gradually build up thread on the spindle. This sounds simple, but requires practice to do well, producing thread that's even and strong. A skilled spinner could work for hours, their hands moving in practiced rhythms, while participating in conversation or listening to stories. Young girls learned spinning from early childhood, and by adulthood, their hands could spin thread almost automatically, without conscious thought. The amount of thread needed was staggering. A single cloak might require several kilometers of thread. A full set of clothing for one person, undergarments, tunic, trousers, cloak, required even more. Multiply this by every person in the household, factor in replacement needs, and you begin to understand why spinning was continuous work. Once thread was spun, weaving began. Viking looms were vertical warp-weighted looms. Frame structures were vertical threads. The warp were held taut by clay or stone weights. Horizontal threads, the weft, were woven through using a shuttle. Weaving was slower than spinning, but produced the fabric from which all clothing was made. A skilled weaver could produce complex patterns, varying colors in stripes or checks, changing thread weights to create different textures. This wasn't just functional. It was artistic expression. The quality and complexity of someone's woven clothing indicated both their wealth and the skill of their household weavers. Sewing transformed fabric into garments. Viking sewing was done with bone or iron needles, using thread made from wool or linen. Seams were sewn with remarkable precision, using stitches that would be recognizable to any modern seamstress. Garments were tailored to fit, not just draped or wrapped. Sleeves were set in carefully. Hems were finished. This required skill and patience. But textile work wasn't just new production. It was constant repair. Every garment in use needed regular inspection and maintenance. A small hole caught early could be easily patched. A small hole ignored would become a large tear that might make the garment unusable. During polar night, regular mending sessions ensured that everyone's clothing remained functional. Footwear required specialized skills. Boots and shoes were made from animal hide, carefully cut and stitched using leather working techniques. The hide needed to be properly tanned, a process that happened during warmer months, then cut to pattern and sewn with strong thread or sinew. Waterproofing was applied using animal fat, rubbed into the leather until it became water-resistant. Making a single pair of boots might take several days of skilled work. They needed to fit properly, protecting feet while allowing enough movement for work. Poorly fitted boots caused blisters that in extreme cold could become frostbite. Badly made boots that let in moisture could mean lost toes or feet. Boot making wasn't casual work. It was precision engineering. Tool maintenance was another essential winter task. Iron tools, axes, knives, needles, anything metal required constant care. In cold, damp conditions, iron rusts quickly. Tools needed to be cleaned, dried, and oiled regularly. Wooden tool handles split or loosened and needed to be repaired or replaced. Sharpening was ongoing work. Axes and knives dulled with use and needed frequent sharpening on whetstones. A sharp blade was safer and more efficient than a dull one, so maintaining sharp edges wasn't optional. The rhythmic sound of blade against stone was a constant background noise in winter longhouses. More complex repairs required metalworking, which meant using the forge. Not every settlement had a dedicated smith, but larger settlements did, and winter was prime time for smithing. Broken tools could be reforged. New tools could be made from scrap metal. Iron was precious, so every scrap was saved and eventually reused. Working iron required high heat, hotter than a normal hearth fire could produce. Smiths used forced air from bellows to increase temperature, transforming the forge into a roaring inferno capable of heating iron to malleability. This work was hot, physically demanding, and dangerous. A smith working in winter might be sweating near the forge while the rest of the household huddled against the cold. Wood carving was both functional and artistic. Vikings carved wooden spoons, bowls, cups, and plates. They carved decorative elements for buildings and belongings. They carved game pieces for entertainment. All of this work could be done by firelight, keeping hands busy during long dark hours. Some wood carving was purely decorative, intricate knotwork patterns, or stylized animals. This wasn't frivolous. It was cultural expression, maintaining connection to artistic traditions and demonstrating skill. A beautifully carved object had value beyond its function, representing the time, skill, and care invested in its creation. Bone and antler working produced tools, combs, needles, and ornaments. Reindeer antler was particularly valuable, hard enough for tool making, but workable with Viking technology. Antler could be carved, filed, and polished into objects of remarkable delicacy. Combs made from antler, with fine teeth carefully cut and smoothed, were personal items of some value. Leather working extended beyond footwear. Leather was used for belts, bags, scabbards, straps, and countless other items. Rawhide needed to be cut, shaped, stitched, and sometimes decorated. Some leather work was purely functional. Some was decorated with tooling, carving patterns into the leather surface, or with dyes creating colored designs. Food processing continued throughout winter. Grain needed to be ground into flour as needed. Dried fish needed to be checked for spoilage, moved to different storage if conditions weren't right. Preserved meat needed attention. This ongoing food management was essential to ensure supplies lasted and nothing was lost to spoilage. Cleaning was a constant challenge. With people and sometimes animals living in close quarters, with limited water for washing, with smoke constantly permeating everything, longhouses got dirty. Floors needed to be swept, old rushes removed and replaced. Sleeping areas needed maintenance. Cooking areas needed cleaning to prevent grease buildup that could fuel fires. Personal hygiene, as mentioned in earlier content, was taken more seriously by Vikings than by many other medieval peoples. Even during polar night, Vikings attempted to maintain cleanliness. Combing hair removed lice and tangles. What washing was possible was done, though full bathing in the sweat lodge was reserved for special occasions due to fuel requirements. Childcare was work that never stopped, regardless of season. Infants needed constant attention, feeding, changing, soothing. Young children needed supervision, education, and entertainment. Polar night with everyone confined indoors made childcare both easier, in that many people were available to help, and harder, in that bored children in a confined space can make life difficult for everyone. Children were educated through apprenticeship and observation. They learned skills by watching adults and attempting tasks under supervision. A child might start helping with spinning by preparing wool fibers, work up to using a spindle under guidance, and eventually spin independently. Every skill was taught this way through progressive participation. Storytelling served multiple purposes during polar night. It was entertainment, keeping people engaged during long dark hours. It was education, passing down cultural knowledge, history, and values. It was memory training, helping people develop the strong memories necessary in a largely non-literate culture. And it was social bonding, bringing the household together in shared experience. Viking stories, the sagas and tales that survive in written form from later centuries, were honed during these winter storytelling sessions. The best storytellers were valued members of the community. They could make time pass, lift spirits, and transmit the cultural heritage that defined what it meant to be Norse. These stories weren't just entertainment. They carried practical information. Stories about navigation contained actual navigational knowledge. Stories about heroes contained lessons about proper behavior and values. Stories about gods explained the world and humanity's place in it. Every story had layers of meaning. Music played a similar role. Vikings had various instruments: lyres, flutes, drums. Music during polar night provided rhythm, emotional release, and communal participation. Songs were work songs helping coordinate labor, narrative songs telling stories, and ritual songs for religious purposes. Singing was participatory. Everyone sang, with varying degrees of skill. Some people were recognized as particularly good singers, but participation mattered more than perfection. The sound of voices raised together in song pushed back the darkness and silence, asserting human presence in a world that seemed determined to crush it. Games and contests, as mentioned in earlier content, were serious business during Polar Night. Board games like Nefatiful required strategy and provided mental stimulation. Dice games added chance and excitement. Physical contests, arm wrestling, or other tests of strength that could be done indoors provided competitive outlet for energy that couldn't be expended in outdoor work. These games weren't childish. They were training for decision-making, strategic thinking, and handling both victory and defeat. They were also social leveling. A thrall might beat a freeman at Nefatiful and earn respect for the skill, even if their social status didn't change. Riddles and word games tested intelligence and wit. Vikings valued cleverness, the ability to use words skillfully. Riddle contests appear in saga literature, and they weren't just fictional entertainment. Real Vikings engaged in verbal sparring as a form of competition and bonding. Religious and spiritual work continued during Polar Night. Rituals to honor the gods, offerings to ensure safety and the sun's return, required preparation and execution. Rune carving, the writing system used by Vikings primarily for magical and memorial purposes, might be done during winter. Creating runes properly required concentration and spiritual preparation, making the quiet, dark months appropriate time for this work. Some work was purely preparatory, planning for spring and summer. Tools needed for farming were checked and repaired. Fishing gear was prepared. Ships that had been pulled ashore for winter were inspected and necessary repairs planned. You couldn't do the repairs in freezing darkness, but you could plan them, gather materials, and be ready when conditions allowed. Trade goods were produced during winter. Items that would be traded during summer, carved objects, textiles, specialty products, were made during winter when time was available. A household might spend all winter producing a quantity of high-quality textiles to trade for goods they couldn't produce themselves. The winter work cycle maintained structure and purpose during Polar Night. Without work, without routine, the darkness and confinement could break people psychologically. But with constant tasks, with skills to practice and things to accomplish, people stayed engaged, connected, and sane. This work was carefully managed to avoid exhaustion. Unlike summer where work was frantic and exhausting, trying to accomplish everything possible during limited good weather, winter work was paced. There was time. You could take breaks, work at a sustainable rhythm, and still accomplish enormous amounts. The work itself became meditative. The repetitive motions of spinning, the rhythmic strikes of carving, the careful precision of sewing, all of this created a mental state that modern people might recognize as mindfulness. You focused on the task at hand, letting other worries fade, finding peace in the work itself. And perhaps most importantly, the work produced tangible results. You could see the thread lengthening on your spindle, the garment growing under your hands, the tool taking shape. In a world of darkness where nothing seemed to progress, where every day looked the same as the last, this tangible progress was psychologically essential. It proved that time was passing, that you were moving towards spring, that this darkness would end. When the sun disappeared below the horizon and stayed there for weeks, then months, the Vikings faced an enemy they couldn't fight with swords or axes. Darkness, not just the absence of light, but the psychological weight of endless night pressing down on every soul trapped in smoky longhouses with the same faces, the same walls, and the same suffocating routine. 3 months without sunlight does something to the human brain. Modern science calls it seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, a condition where lack of sunlight disrupts your body's internal clock, drains your serotonin levels, and leaves you feeling hopeless, exhausted, and irritable. The Vikings didn't have a name for it, but they knew it well. They called it the winter sickness or the dark mind, and they understood that if you let it take hold, it could kill you just as surely as frostbite. But here's the thing. The Vikings didn't just survive this psychological nightmare. They developed strategies, some intentional, some cultural, that kept their minds sharp and their spirits fighting even when the world outside was frozen solid and pitch black. Let's start with the most obvious coping mechanism, alcohol. Now, before you think this was just an excuse to get drunk for 3 months straight, understand that alcohol served multiple purposes in Viking society during Polar Night. Mead and ale weren't just beverages. They were social glue, mood stabilizers, and sometimes the only thing standing between a person and complete mental breakdown. Viking mead was made from fermented honey, water, and whatever herbs or fruits they could preserve. It was sweet, potent, and relatively easy to produce in large quantities before winter set in. Ale was brewed from barley or other grains, flavored with bog myrtle or yarrow since hops weren't commonly used yet. Both drinks were consumed daily, not to the point of stumbling drunkenness, but enough to take the edge off the darkness. Around the fire at night, families would pass drinking horns filled with mead. The warmth of the alcohol spreading through cold bodies, the slight buzz that made the smoky air seem less oppressive, the loosening of tongues that led to laughter and stories. This wasn't escapism. It was deliberate psychological maintenance. The Vikings knew that if you let people sit in silence with their dark thoughts for too long, those thoughts would spread like disease. But alcohol alone wouldn't save you. The Vikings understood something profound about human psychology, that the mind needs stimulation, challenge, and purpose, even in the darkest times. Especially in the darkest times. So they filled the endless nights with activities that engaged their brains and kept depression at bay. Storytelling was the crown jewel of Viking mental health strategy. In a culture without books, television, or any form of recorded entertainment, stories were everything. And during Polar Night, storytelling became an art form elevated to near sacred status. Every longhouse had its designated storytellers, usually older men or women who had lived long enough to accumulate a vast collection of tales. These weren't simple bedtime stories. Viking sagas were epic, multi-night performances that could last hours. They told of gods and giants, of heroes and monsters, of voyages to distant lands and battles that shook the earth. The storyteller would sit closest to the fire, their face illuminated by flickering flames, their voice rising and falling with the drama of the tale. Children would sit wide-eyed, listening to stories of Thor battling the Midgard serpent or Odin sacrificing his eye for wisdom. Young warriors would hear tales of legendary fighters like Sigurd the Dragon Slayer or Ragnar Lothbrok. Women would listen to stories of powerful shield maidens and clever queens who outwitted kings and gods alike. But here's what made Viking storytelling so psychologically effective during Polar Night. The stories weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for life. They taught courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They showed characters enduring suffering and emerging stronger. They reminded listeners that darkness, whether literal or metaphorical, always eventually gives way to light. The story of Baldur's death and the coming of Ragnarok, for instance, wasn't just a tragic tale. It was a reminder that even gods face darkness and loss, and that the world itself goes through cycles of destruction and rebirth. When you're sitting in pitch darkness for the 10th week straight, hearing about how the world will be destroyed and then renewed, how the sun will rise again even after the great winter of Fimbulwinter, that's not just a story. That's hope in narrative form. And the interactive nature of storytelling meant that everyone's mind was engaged. Listeners would interject with questions, challenge details, or add their own embellishments. Young people learning the stories would practice retelling them, which meant actively using their memory and creativity. This kept minds sharp when the natural tendency would be to sink into passive depression. Music was another critical tool. The Vikings made instruments from whatever materials they had. Bone flutes, wooden lyres, drums made from stretched animal hide. During the darkest nights, someone would always start playing and others would join in. The music wasn't sophisticated by modern standards, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to fill the silence with something other than the howling wind outside. Singing was even more important. Viking work songs, drinking songs, and ballads served multiple purposes. They synchronized group activities like weaving or food preparation. They reinforced cultural identity and shared values. And most importantly, they gave people a way to express emotions that couldn't be spoken. When you're trapped indoors with the same 20 people for months, you can't always say what you're feeling, but you can sing about it. The Vikings also had a dark, biting sense of humor that served as psychological armor against despair. They made jokes about everything: death, suffering, the gods themselves. This wasn't disrespect. It was defiance. When you can laugh at the darkness, it loses some of its power over you. Viking humor during polar night was particularly brutal and self-deprecating. They'd mock each other's appearance after months without proper washing. "Bjorn, you smell like a dead walrus that's been left in the sun, except there is no sun, so you just smell like regular dead walrus." They'd make jokes about the monotony of the food. "If I eat one more piece of dried fish, I'm going to grow gills and swim away, which would be nice except the sea is frozen solid like my wife's heart." They even made jokes about going crazy from the darkness. How do you know if someone's been inside too long during polar night? They start having conversations with the goats, and the goats start answering back. This kind of humor acknowledged the psychological strain they were under while simultaneously robbing it of its power to destroy them. Games and competitions were another crucial element of mental health maintenance. The Vikings played board games, particularly Nefatiful, a strategy game where one player defends a king piece while the other tries to capture it. This game could take hours, and serious players would spend days analyzing strategies and planning future matches. Dice games were also popular, often involving small wagers of food, tools, or favors. The gambling aspect added excitement and gave people something to look forward to. "If I win this round, you're doing my share of wood splitting when spring comes." These small stakes games created ongoing narratives and rivalries that lasted throughout the polar night. Physical competitions also continued indoors, adapted for the cramped space of longhouses. Arm wrestling contests, tests of strength like lifting heavy stones or pushing contests. Wrestling matches that had to be carefully controlled so nobody crashed into the fire or broke essential tools. These competitions served multiple purposes. They burned excess energy, maintained physical fitness, allowed for harmless release of aggression, and most importantly, gave people something to train for and talk about. But perhaps the most sophisticated psychological strategy the Vikings employed was the deliberate creation of routine and purpose. Modern psychology tells us that one of the most damaging aspects of depression is the loss of structure and meaning. The Vikings, without knowing the science, understood this instinctively. Every day during polar night had structure. Morning started with tending the fire, checking on the livestock in their section of the longhouse, and preparing the first meal. This meal was eaten together, and even if it was just porridge and dried fish for the 100th day in a row, the act of eating together reinforced social bonds. After the morning meal came work time, and there was always work. Women would spin wool, weave cloth, or sew garments. The spinning wheel or drop spindle would turn for hours, the rhythmic motion almost meditative. This wasn't busy work. Every piece of cloth produced, every garment sewn, was essential for survival. Knowing that your work had genuine purpose, that your family would literally freeze without the clothes you made, gave meaning to the endless hours of labor. Men would work on tool repair and weapon maintenance. Axe blades needed sharpening. Spear shafts needed straightening. Shields needed new leather fittings. This work was equally purposeful. Come spring, these tools would mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, between successful defense and vulnerability to raiders. Craftwork was taken to extraordinary levels during polar night. With nothing but time, Viking artisans created intricate wood carvings, bone combs decorated with elaborate designs, antler buttons, and jewelry. This wasn't just practical work. It was artistic expression, a way for individuals to assert their creativity and skill in an environment that could feel suffocatingly uniform. Some of the most beautiful surviving Viking artifacts were likely made during polar night. Imagine sitting by firelight, carving intricate patterns into a piece of walrus ivory, losing yourself in the work for hours. The outside world is frozen and dark, but in this moment, you're creating something beautiful, something that will last long after this particular winter is forgotten. Children had their own structured activities. They were taught skills appropriate to their age and gender. Young girls learned to spin and weave, starting with simple projects and gradually advancing. Young boys learned to carve wood, starting with simple shapes and progressing to more complex forms. Older children took on more responsibility, essentially functioning as additional adults in the household economy. But children also played. and their play was encouraged because adults understood that children needed outlets for their energy even more than adults did. Indoor games, storytelling competitions, singing, learning to play simple musical instruments. In some ways, children adapted better to polar night than adults because their minds were more flexible, more able to find wonder and entertainment in small things. Education also continued during polar night. This was when children learned the sagas and family histories, when they were taught about the gods and the proper ways to honor them, when they learned the laws and customs that governed Viking society. Older children might be taught runes, the Viking writing system, by scratching practice symbols into wood or bone. The Vikings also maintained what we might call mental health check-ins, though they wouldn't have used that term. Elders in the household paid attention to who was struggling, who was withdrawing too much, who was showing signs of the dark mind. When someone was identified as struggling, the response was communal and practical. If someone was sinking into depression, they might be given a special task, something important that only they could do. This renewed sense of purpose could pull someone back from the edge. Or they might be deliberately included in social activities, pulled into conversations, asked for their opinion on matters, reminded that they were valued members of the community. The Vikings understood that isolation within isolation was deadly. If you were already trapped in a longhouse for months, retreating further into yourself could be fatal. So they prevented it, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully. Olaf, stop staring at the wall and come help us settle this argument about whether Loki or Thor would win in a drinking contest. We need someone with actual sense. Sleep patterns during polar night were also interesting from a psychological perspective. Without the sun to regulate circadian rhythms, the Vikings essentially created their own day-night cycle. The longhouse would be most active during what would have been daytime hours, even though it was dark outside. Work, meals, and social activities happened during this day period. Then, at a designated time, the fire would be banked down to coals, people would retire to their sleeping platforms, and the longhouse would quiet. This artificial day-night cycle helped maintain some sense of normalcy and prevented the complete psychological disorientation that can come from living in constant darkness. But sleep during polar night was different. Many Vikings probably experienced what modern researchers call segmented sleep, where you sleep for a few hours, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then sleep again. During these middle-of-the-night waking periods, people might lie quietly thinking, engage in quiet conversation with a bed partner, do small tasks like tending the fire, or engage in intimate activities with their spouse. This segmented sleep pattern, which might seem strange to modern people used to 8 consecutive hours, was actually well-suited to polar night conditions. It meant someone was always semi-alert in case the fire needed tending or an emergency arose. It also provided natural breaks in the long darkness, moments of quiet reflection that could be psychologically restorative. Religion and spirituality played a massive role in maintaining mental health during polar night. The Vikings believed that the gods themselves struggled against darkness and chaos. This wasn't just abstract theology. It was deeply personal and immediately relevant when you were living in 3 months of darkness. Odin, the All-Father, had sacrificed his eye to gain wisdom and hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the runes. These weren't comfortable, easy stories. They were tales of suffering, sacrifice, and the pursuit of knowledge and power at great cost. When you heard these stories during polar night, they reminded you that even the gods had to endure hardship to achieve greatness. Thor, the most popular god among common Vikings, spent his time battling giants and monsters that threatened the order of the world. The giants represented chaos, cold, and destruction. Thor's endless fight against them was a metaphor for the Viking struggle against the harsh environment. Every storm Thor weathered, every giant he defeated, was proof that strength and determination could overcome even the most terrible odds. Freyr and Freya, the fertility deities, represented the promise of spring and renewal. During the darkest parts of polar night, prayers and offerings to Freyr weren't just religious observance. They were psychological anchors, reminders that winter and darkness were not permanent states, that the cycle would turn, that life and light would return. The Vikings made offerings during polar night, small sacrifices of food or drink poured onto the fire or left at household shrines. These weren't desperate pleas. They were affirmations of faith in the cosmic order. We give to you, gods, trusting that you will see us through this darkness as you have before. Some families maintained small household altars with carved figures of the gods. During particularly difficult nights, family members might sit near these altars, not necessarily praying in the way Christians pray, but simply being in the presence of the divine, drawing strength from the connection to something larger than themselves. The concept of WIRD, or fate, was also psychologically important. The Vikings believed that everyone's fate was woven by the Norns, three powerful beings who lived at the base of Yggdrasil. Your fate was set, but how you faced it, your courage and conduct in the face of whatever WIRD brought you, that was entirely under your control. This belief system was perfectly designed for surviving polar night. You couldn't control the darkness. You couldn't make the sun return any faster, but you could control how you faced the darkness. You could endure with courage, maintain your honor, support your family and community, and refuse to let the darkness break your spirit. That was your choice, and in making that choice, you proved yourself worthy. Dreams also held special significance during polar night. With more time spent sleeping and the disorienting effect of constant darkness, people reported more vivid and memorable dreams. The Vikings believed that dreams could be messages from the gods, visions of the future, or visits from the spirits of ancestors. A household might gather in the morning and share dreams, discussing their possible meanings. This practice served multiple purposes. It was entertaining, filling time with discussion and interpretation. It reinforced spiritual beliefs, and it gave people a sense that even in sleep, even in darkness, they were connected to larger forces and destinies. Prophetic dreams were particularly valued. If someone dreamed of spring flowers or returning birds, it would be seen as a positive omen, a message that winter's end was approaching. These dreams, whether genuinely prophetic or simply wishful thinking, provided hope and something to talk about for days. The Vikings also understood the importance of touch and physical contact for psychological well-being, though they wouldn't have articulated it in those terms. Families slept close together, not just for warmth, but for the comfort of human presence. Children were held and comforted. Couples maintained physical intimacy. Even simple things like grooming each other's hair, checking each other for lice, or sharing body heat under blankets reinforced social bonds and provided the physical contact humans need to maintain mental health. In a world without professional therapists or antidepressants, the Vikings relied on each other. The community structure of the longhouse, where multiple families shared space, meant that nobody was ever truly alone with their darkest thoughts. There was always someone nearby, always the possibility of conversation, always the comfort of human presence. But we should be honest. Not everyone made it through polar night with their sanity intact. Some people did break under the pressure. Historical records and saga accounts mention individuals who became violent, who withdrew completely, or who simply couldn't handle the darkness and isolation. When someone truly lost their grip on sanity, the response varied. In some cases, they might be physically restrained if they became dangerous. In other cases, they might be isolated in a separate part of the longhouse, cared for but kept away from others. In extreme cases, in the rarest and most severe situations, someone who had become completely unmanageable might be forced to leave the settlement, which in the middle of polar night was essentially a death sentence. These harsh realities remind us that Viking mental health strategies, while sophisticated and effective for most people, weren't perfect. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had, living in conditions that would challenge even modern people equipped with electric lights, central heating, and psychiatric medication. Yet the remarkable thing is how well their strategies worked for the vast majority of people. Generation after generation of Vikings survived 3 months of polar night and emerged on the other side not just alive, but mentally intact, ready to resume their lives of farming, fishing, trading, and raiding. The key was in the combination of strategies. No single thing kept the Vikings sane during polar night. It was the alcohol and the stories and the games and the work and the laughter and the music and the faith and the community and the routine all working together, each element reinforcing the others, creating a web of psychological support that could bear the weight of 3 months of darkness. Modern people living in Arctic regions still use many of these strategies, often without realizing they're following ancient patterns. They maintain strict routines. They engage in social activities. They find purpose in work. They use humor to cope. They drink, perhaps more than they should. They tell stories and play games. They hold on to faith, whether religious or secular. They support each other through the darkness. Because in the end, surviving polar night, whether you're a Viking in 900 CE or a modern person in Tromsø today, comes down to the same fundamental truth. You can't control the darkness, but you can control how you face it. You can give in to despair, or you can light a fire, tell a story, pour a drink, laugh at a joke, carve something beautiful, hold someone you love, and refuse to let the darkness win. The Vikings chose defiance. Night after night, week after week, month after month, they sat in their smoky longhouses surrounded by family and livestock and said, "Not today, darkness. Not today." And when the sun finally did return, they had won. Not because they were superhuman, but because they understood something profound about the human spirit, that it can endure almost anything, as long as it has purpose, community, and hope. When the world went dark for 3 months, the Vikings didn't just rely on practical survival strategies and psychological coping mechanisms. They turned to something deeper, older, and more powerful than any fire or food storage. They turned to the gods. And in the longest nights of the year, Viking spirituality transformed from casual observance into desperate, beautiful, necessary communion with forces that controlled the sun, the seasons, and life itself. To understand Viking rituals during polar night, you need to understand that Norse religion wasn't like modern faiths. There were no churches, no holy books, no organized clergy with strict doctrines. Instead, Viking spirituality was deeply personal, intensely practical, and completely woven into daily life. The gods weren't distant figures you prayed to on Sundays. They were active participants in your world, beings you could bargain with, honor, and occasionally curse when things went wrong. During polar night, this relationship became more intense. The darkness wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a manifestation of cosmic forces, the giants of cold and chaos pushing against the ordered world. And if giants were involved, you needed gods on your side. Let's start with the most important religious event of the polar night period, Yule. Now, everyone today knows about Christmas, but most people don't realize that many Christmas traditions, from the tree to the feast to the gift-giving, came directly from the Viking Yule celebration. And Yule wasn't just a party. It was a critical spiritual ritual designed to ensure that the sun would return and that the community would survive until spring. Yule typically began around the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year. The timing wasn't arbitrary. The solstice was the turning point, the moment when the sun's retreat stopped and it began, slowly, to return toward the earth. For Vikings living through polar night, this moment had profound significance. It was proof that the cycle continued, that winter wasn't eternal, that the gods still maintained order against the forces of chaos. Preparations for Yule began weeks in advance. Animals were slaughtered, usually pigs or cattle, saved specifically for this purpose. This wasn't wasteful. The meat would be preserved and eaten throughout the rest of winter, but the act of slaughter itself had ritual significance. The blood was collected in special bowls and used in blessing ceremonies. The Yule feast was the centerpiece of the celebration. Remember, these people had been eating preserved, dried, salted, and generally monotonous food for months. The Yule feast was an explosion of abundance in the middle of scarcity. Fresh meat, roasted and boiled. Bread made from carefully hoarded grain. The best preserved fruits and vegetables brought out from storage. And of course, massive quantities of ale and mead, brewed specifically for this occasion. But this wasn't just gluttony. The feast was a ritual of thanksgiving and hope. Every bite of fresh meat was an acknowledgement that the livestock had served their purpose, providing for the community. Every drink of mead was an offering to your companions, living and dead. The act of feasting together reinforced social bonds that had been strained by months of close quarters and darkness. The religious element of Yule was profound. Viking families made offerings to the gods, particularly Freyr, the god of fertility, harvest, and prosperity. Freyr was closely associated with the sun and the return of growing season. During Yule, special toasts called Bragerful were drunk in honor of the gods. The head of the household would stand, raise a horn of mead, and speak. Hail to Odin, All-Father, wanderer in darkness, seeker of wisdom. We honor you and ask for your guidance through the dark months ahead. Then the horn would be passed, and each person would drink. Some of the mead poured onto the fire as a direct offering to the god. The flames would flare up, consuming the offering, carrying it to the divine realm. Hail to Thor, Thunderer, protector of Midgard, fighter of giants. Your strength is our strength. Your courage is our courage. Guard us against the chaos that threatens in the darkness. More mead poured, more flames rising. These weren't empty words. For people living in constant darkness, feeling the weight of winter, these invocations were genuine pleas for protection and promises of devotion. Hail to Freyr, Lord of sunshine and harvest. We give to you now, trusting that you will return to us with the spring. May the suns will turn. May warmth return. May life return. This toast to Freyr was perhaps the most important. The Vikings believed that the gods required honor and offerings to maintain their power and interest in human affairs. By giving to Freyr during Yule, they were essentially making a contract. We honor you now, in the darkness, trusting that you will bring back the light. The Yule log was another crucial element of the celebration. A massive piece of wood, usually oak, was brought into the longhouse with ceremony. This wasn't just firewood. The Yule log was carefully selected months in advance, often the largest, straightest piece of oak that could be found. Oak was sacred to Thor, and burning it honored the thunder god while also producing exceptional heat and long-lasting coals. The Yule log was lit using a piece of the previous year's Yule log, which had been carefully saved. This created an unbroken chain of fire stretching back generations, connecting the present celebration to all the Yules that had come before and all that would come after. As the log was placed in the fire, the household would gather around and prayers would be spoken. The log was meant to burn throughout the Yule celebration, which could last anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on the community's resources and traditions. Keeping the Yule log burning continuously was a sacred duty. It represented the eternal nature of the sun, the persistence of light against darkness. If the Yule log went out, it was considered a terrible omen, suggesting that the family had lost the god's favor. Throughout the Yule period, Vikings engaged in practices designed to honor the dead. The barrier between the living world and the realm of the dead was believed to be thinnest during the darkest part of the year. This wasn't scary to the Vikings, the way modern people might find it creepy. It was an opportunity to reconnect with ancestors, to draw on their wisdom and strength. Extra places would be set at the Yule feast for dead family members. Not everyone did this, but many families maintained the tradition. A bowl of food, a horn of mead, set aside for grandfather who died 3 winters ago, for the baby who didn't survive last spring, for the warrior brother who fell in battle. These weren't expected to be physically consumed. They were symbolic offerings, acknowledgments that death didn't sever family bonds. Some Vikings believed that the dead could actually visit during Yule. Children would be told to behave because grandmother's spirit might be watching. Adults would speak respectfully, avoiding curses or harsh words that might offend ancestral spirits. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, someone might claim to have seen a shade, a ghostly figure at the edge of the firelight, just for a moment. Whether these were genuine supernatural experiences, hallucinations brought on by stress and darkness, or simply stories people told to feel connected to lost loved ones, they served an important purpose. They reminded Vikings that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first people and forward to generations yet unborn. The Wild Hunt was another supernatural belief associated with the darkest nights of winter. According to legend, Odin himself would lead a spectral hunt across the night sky, accompanied by the dead, spirits, and gods. To see the Wild Hunt was considered both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It was a reminder of Odin's power, but also a portent of death and change. During polar night, particularly during the Yule period, people would sometimes report hearing the Wild Hunt, the sound of horns in the distance, the baying of otherworldly hounds, the thunder of hooves in the sky. Were these genuine supernatural phenomena? Probably not. More likely, they were natural sounds, wind howling through mountains, ice cracking on frozen fjords, transformed by darkness and imagination into something mythic. But the belief in the wild hunt served a purpose. It encouraged people to stay indoors during the most dangerous nights, preventing them from wandering off into the darkness where they could easily get lost and freeze to death. Don't go outside tonight, child. The wild hunt rides, and Odin might take you if he sees you. Supernatural fear keeping people safe from very real natural dangers. The Vikings also performed blot, sacrifice ceremonies throughout the polar night, not just during Yule. These ceremonies could be elaborate community affairs or simple household rituals. The word blot comes from a root meaning to strengthen, and that's exactly what these ceremonies were meant to do. Strengthen the connection between the human and divine worlds. Strengthen the community's bonds with the gods who controlled their fate. Animal sacrifice was common. A chicken, a goat, in wealthier communities sometimes a horse or an ox. The animal would be killed ritually, often by the head of the household or a respected elder. The blood was collected in a special bowl called a hlotbali. Then, using a small bundle of twigs or herbs called a hlotine, the blood would be sprinkled on the altar, on the participants, and on the walls of the longhouse. This wasn't the gruesome, evil practice that Christian sources later made it out to be. It was a deeply meaningful ritual. The blood represented life force, the essence of the animal being given to the gods and shared by the community. By marking themselves with blood, Vikings believed they were taking on some of the animal's strength and also demonstrating their commitment to the gods. After the blood ritual, the animal would be butchered and cooked, and the meat shared in a communal feast. This was crucial. The sacrifice wasn't just giving something to the gods and getting nothing back. It was an exchange, a shared meal between humans and the divine. The gods received the blood and the spirit of the animal. The humans received the meat and the blessing. Women played important roles in Viking religious life, particularly during polar night. The Volva, a type of seeress or wise woman, was a respected and sometimes feared figure. A Volva would travel from community to community, offering prophecies, blessings, and magical assistance. During polar night, a visit from a Volva was a major event. The Volva would arrive, often traveling even in harsh conditions, because her services were in demand during the darkest months. She would be welcomed with honor, given the best seat near the fire, offered the best food and drink. Then, at the appointed time, she would perform Seidr, a form of Norse magic associated with prophecy and shaping fate. The ceremony was elaborate. The Volva would sit on a high platform, often a special chair prepared just for this purpose. She would wear specific ritual garments, often a cloak of blue or black decorated with stones and animal figures. She might carry a staff decorated with brass and stones. Around her, women of the household would sing special songs, called Vardloker, designed to call spirits and open the pathways between worlds. As the singing continued, the Volva would enter a trance state. Her eyes might roll back, her body might sway, and then she would speak, answering questions about the future. Will the winter end safely? Will our crops grow in spring? Will our men return safe from raiding season? Will the sickness that took our child last year return? Her answers weren't always comforting, but they gave people something the darkness threatened to take away, a sense of the future, a belief that there was a path forward even if it couldn't be seen yet. Whether the Volva's prophecies came from genuine supernatural insight, from a deep understanding of human nature and natural patterns, or from educated guessing, they provided psychological relief to communities struggling with the uncertainty of polar night. Men also practiced forms of magic, though different from the Seidr associated with women. Runes, the Norse writing system, were believed to have magical properties. The runes weren't just letters, they were symbols of power, each one associated with specific forces and concepts. Fehu represented wealth and cattle. Uras meant strength and health. Thurisaz was protection and the power of Thor. During polar night, men would carve runes into wood, bone, or stone, creating talismans and amulets meant to protect the household. A simple piece of wood with the right runes carved into it and stained with blood or painted with ochre could be hung over the door to ward off evil spirits, or placed under a sick person's bed to aid healing, or carried by someone venturing outside to protect them from the dangers of the dark. The creation of runic talismans was often accompanied by spoken charms or galder, rhythmic chanting that activated the rune's power. A man might carve the rune Algies, representing protection, while chanting Algies, shield and ward, guardian strong, danger barred. Over and over, his voice rising and falling in a pattern that was as much music as speech. These practices weren't separate from daily life. They were woven into everything. You didn't just sharpen your axe. You might carve a protective rune on the handle while doing so. You didn't just prepare food. You might speak a small blessing over it. You didn't just go to sleep. You might trace a protective sign in the air above your sleeping child. The concept of Hemingja is important to understand here. Hemingja was a kind of spiritual luck or personal power that every person possessed. It could be strong or weak, and it could be influenced by your actions and by the will of the gods. During polar night, maintaining your Hemingja was crucial. If your Hemingja weakened, you became vulnerable to sickness, accidents, and misfortune. How did you maintain Hemingja? By living honorably, by fulfilling your obligations to family and community, by honoring the gods, by facing hardship with courage. Every time you got up on a cold morning and did your work despite wanting to stay in bed, you strengthened your Hemingja. Every time you shared food when it would have been easier to hoard it, you strengthened your Hemingja. Every time you told a joke that made your miserable family laugh, you strengthened your Hemingja. This belief system created a self-reinforcing cycle of resilience. Your actions affected your spiritual power, which affected your ability to survive and thrive, which affected how you were viewed by your community, which affected your self-perception, which affected your actions. Vikings who maintained strong Hemingja were more likely to survive polar night, not because of magic, but because the belief in Hemingja encouraged behaviors that led to survival. The gods themselves were believed to struggle during winter and darkness. The myth of Baldur's death, for instance, was closely associated with winter. Baldur, the most beloved of the gods, was killed through Loki's trickery, and his death brought grief and darkness to the world. He was destined to remain in Hell, the realm of the dead, until after Ragnarok, the end of the world. For Vikings sitting in polar darkness, Baldur's story resonated deeply. The good, the light, the beautiful, all temporarily lost to darkness and death. But the story also promised that Baldur would return, that after the world's destruction and renewal, he would live again in a better world. Winter and darkness weren't permanent. They were part of a cycle, painful but necessary. Thor's battles with the frost giants took on special meaning during polar night. Every blizzard, every particularly cold night, could be imagined as Thor fighting against the giants who wanted to freeze the world into eternal winter. When the cold relented, even briefly, that was Thor winning a battle. When it came back worse than before, that was the giants pushing back. But Thor never gave up, and neither would the Vikings. Skadi, the goddess associated with winter, hunting, and skiing, was honored during polar night. Skadi was a complex figure, not entirely benevolent, but not evil either. She represented winter's harsh beauty, its dangers, and its opportunities. Prayers to Skadi weren't asking her to go away. They were asking for her favor, for safe passage through her domain, for success in winter hunting. Some communities held specific rituals for Skadi. Offerings of meat from successful hunts would be left at outdoor altars, even in the darkness and cold. Young hunters would pray to her for skill and luck. And stories were told of Skadi's marriage to Njord, the god of the sea, and how they could never quite live together because she loved the mountains and winter while he loved the coast and summer. This story reflected the Viking understanding that winter and summer were fundamentally opposed forces, and human life existed in the tension between them. The sun itself was personified as a goddess, Sol, who rode her chariot across the sky, chased by a wolf named Skoll who wanted to devour her. According to prophecy, at Ragnarok, Skoll would finally catch and swallow Sol, plunging the world into darkness. But even then, hope remained, because Sol had a daughter who would take her place after the world was renewed. During polar night, when the sun disappeared, it was easy to imagine that Skoll had finally caught up with Sol, that the prophecy was coming true. Children would ask, what if the wolf has eaten the sun? What if it never comes back? And elders would explain, gently but firmly, the sun always returns. It has for all the generations before us, and it will for all the generations after. We must have faith and endure. This faith wasn't passive. Vikings believed that human actions could influence the gods and the cosmic order. By maintaining courage, by honoring the gods, by living according to their values, they were doing their part to ensure that the cycle continued, that the sun would return, that winter would give way to spring. Prayer in Norse religion was different from prayer in Christianity or Islam. Vikings didn't typically kneel or bow their heads. They stood upright, sometimes with arms raised, speaking directly to the gods as you might speak to a powerful but approachable chieftain. Thor, you who protect Midgard, we need your strength now. The cold bites deep. Help us endure. Direct, honest, transactional. And the gods were expected to respond, not necessarily with miracles, but with subtle assistance. A fire that burned a bit warmer. A storm that passed more quickly than expected. A successful hunt against the odds. These could all be interpreted as signs of divine favor, and they reinforced faith and hope. Divination practices increased during polar night. With so much uncertainty about whether the household would survive until spring, people wanted any glimpse of the future they could get. In addition to the elaborate cedar ceremonies performed by vulvas, ordinary people practiced simpler forms of divination. Casting runestones was one method. A set of stones or pieces of wood, each marked with a different rune, would be cast onto a cloth or the ground. The pattern they made, which runes landed face up, and the relationships between them would be interpreted to answer questions or provide guidance. Reading omens in fire was another common practice. The way flames moved, the shapes formed by coals, the sounds of wood burning, all could be interpreted by someone with the knowledge. A flame that suddenly flared bright might mean good fortune coming. A log that split with a loud crack might warn of conflict ahead. Excessive smoke might suggest that spirits were displeased. Animal behavior was also carefully observed for omens. A raven, Odin's sacred bird, seen flying in a particular direction might guide a decision. A particularly productive laying hen might be seen as a sign of Freya's blessing. Even the behavior of the livestock sharing the longhouse could be meaningful. A cow that suddenly became agitated might be sensing something humans couldn't perceive, a warning to be cautious. Dreams, as mentioned earlier, were considered significant, but during the religious period of Yule and the darkest nights, dreams were even more carefully analyzed. A dream of fire might mean different things depending on context. Was it a destructive fire or a warming hearth fire? Who else was in the dream? What emotions did you feel? Every detail could be meaningful. Some families kept dream logs of sorts, with someone designated to remember and recount significant dreams. These would be discussed at length, with elders offering interpretations based on their knowledge of symbols and their understanding of the dreamer's situation. A young warrior dreaming of wolves might be receiving a message from Odin, who was associated with wolves. A mother dreaming of a tree full of fruit might be receiving assurance from Freyr that her family would prosper. Sacred spaces existed even within the longhouse. A corner might be designated as a VE, a holy area where a small altar held carved images of the gods, offerings, and sacred objects. This space would be kept clean and respected. Children would be taught not to play there. Animals would be kept away from it. And when someone needed to pray or make an offering, they would go to this space, light a small lamp or candle if they had such luxuries, and speak to the gods. Some households had more elaborate altars. Wealthy families might have bronze or silver figurines of the gods. Thor with his hammer, Odin with his spear, Freyr with symbols of fertility. These weren't worshipped in the sense that Christians worship crosses. They were more like communication devices, focal points that helped direct prayers and intentions toward the divine. Outside altars, when accessible, were even more important. Stone cairns, ancient sacred groves, or specific rock formations that had been holy sites for generations. During polar night, visiting these places was dangerous, but some people would still make the journey for important rituals. Walking through darkness and cold to reach a sacred site was itself a form of offering, a demonstration of devotion that strengthened the bond between human and divine. Community ceremonies were larger versions of household rituals. When conditions allowed, multiple families from nearby farms might gather at a central location for a major blot. These gatherings served both religious and social functions. They reinforced bonds between families, allowed young people to meet potential spouses, enabled the exchange of news and goods, and created a sense of shared purpose and identity. A community blot during polar night was an impressive event. Multiple animals might be sacrificed, the meat distributed according to social standing and need. Massive fires would be built, visible for miles, pushing back the darkness. The chieftain or a respected elder would lead the ceremonies, but everyone participated, speaking the ritual words together, sharing in the offerings, joining in the feast. These gatherings also included athletic competitions, even in winter. Wrestling, stone lifting, archery contests using targets illuminated by firelight. The competitions weren't just entertainment, they were offerings in their own right. Displays of strength and skill honored Thor. Displays of accuracy honored Ullr, the god of archery and skiing. The best competitors gained honor and reputation, but everyone who participated honored the gods through their effort. Music and dance were part of religious ceremonies, not just entertainment. Drums, flutes, and rhythmic chanting created an atmosphere that helped participants enter altered states of consciousness, opening themselves to divine influence. Dances weren't the elegant performances we might imagine today. They were vigorous, sometimes wild movements designed to raise energy and demonstrate devotion. Sacrifice of valuable objects was another form of offering, separate from animal sacrifice. A warrior might throw a sword into a sacred spring or bog, permanently removing it from use as an offering to the gods. A woman might sacrifice her finest piece of jewelry. These weren't casual gifts, they were genuine sacrifices, giving up something valuable to demonstrate devotion and request divine favor. The theology underlying all these practices was essentially transactional, but not coldly so. The Vikings believed in reciprocity with the gods. If you honored them, they would honor you. If you were generous to them, they would be generous to you. But this wasn't about buying divine favor. It was about maintaining relationships. Just as you would give gifts to your chieftain and expect protection in return, you gave to the gods and expected their attention to your needs. But there was also genuine love and devotion in Viking religion. Thor wasn't just a protector you hired. He was the friend of mankind, the god who genuinely cared about human welfare. Freyr wasn't just a force you manipulated for good harvests. He was the benevolent lord who wanted life to flourish. These relationships had emotional depth, not just transactional coldness. Children were taught prayers and rituals from an early age. A mother might teach her daughter a simple blessing to speak over the morning meal. A father might teach his son how to properly carve a protective rune. Religious education was continuous and practical, embedded in daily life rather than confined to special occasions. The concept of Orlog, often translated as fate or primal layers, was central to Viking spirituality. Orlog represented the accumulated weight of all past actions, both your own and those of your ancestors, that shaped your present circumstances and future possibilities. During polar night, Vikings were acutely aware that they were living out their Orlog, that their survival or death was in some sense already woven into the fabric of reality. But, and this is crucial, accepting Orlog didn't mean passive resignation. It meant understanding that while you couldn't change what had already been set in motion, you could face it with courage and dignity. Your Orlog might include dying this winter, but you still had choices about how you faced that death. Would you die with honor, having done everything possible to help your family survive? Or would you give up and die in shame? The outcome might be the same, but the manner of facing it mattered immensely. This belief system was perfectly designed for surviving polar night. It acknowledged the harsh reality that despite your best efforts, you might not survive. Some families wouldn't make it to spring, that was just fact. But it also insisted that your response to that reality, your courage, your honor, your effort mattered in ways that transcended mere survival. Religious festivals and rituals throughout polar night weren't just about making requests of the gods. They were about maintaining cosmic order. The Vikings believed that the universe was always threatened by chaos, by the forces of cold, darkness, and dissolution represented by the frost giants and other monsters. The gods fought against these forces, but human actions also mattered. By maintaining their rituals, by honoring the gods even in the darkest times, Vikings believed they were doing their part to support cosmic order. Every properly performed blot, every prayer spoken with sincere devotion, every offering made despite scarcity, these were contributions to the ongoing battle against chaos. In a very real sense, humans and gods were partners in maintaining the world. This gave profound meaning to even simple acts. When you carefully tended the fire through a long dark night, you weren't just keeping your family warm, you were maintaining the presence of heat and light in the world, supporting the sun in her battle against the darkness. When you shared food with a hungry neighbor despite your own limited supplies, you weren't just being kind. You were demonstrating the generosity and honor that upheld social order against the dissolution that darkness and scarcity could bring. The return of the sun after polar night wasn't just a natural phenomenon to be noted, it was a religious event to be celebrated with full ceremony. We'll discuss this more in the next segment, but it's important to understand that the first sunrise after months of darkness was greeted as proof that the gods had prevailed, that the cosmic order held, that human devotion had been recognized and rewarded. In the end, Viking religion during polar night served multiple functions simultaneously. It provided explanations for natural phenomena that would otherwise be terrifying and inexplicable. It gave people a sense of agency and purpose when circumstances were largely beyond their control. It reinforced social bonds and community cohesion through shared rituals and beliefs. It connected individuals to something larger than themselves, to their ancestors, to their descendants, to cosmic forces and eternal patterns. Was it true? Did the gods actually exist? Did the sacrifices and prayers actually influence supernatural forces? These questions miss the point. For the Vikings living through 3 months of darkness, their religious beliefs and practices worked. They provided the meaning, hope, and structure necessary to survive conditions that would break less spiritually prepared people. When you're cold, hungry, exhausted, and sitting in complete darkness for the 85th day in a row, being able to speak to Thor and trust that he hears you, being able to make an offering to Freyr and believe it will make a difference, being able to gather with your family around a sacred fire and feel connected to forces greater than your suffering, these aren't empty gestures. They're survival tools as necessary as fur cloaks and stored food. The Vikings survived polar night not just with their bodies and practical skills, but with their souls and their connection to the divine. And in the darkest hours, when even the strongest warriors felt fear, it was that spiritual connection, that faith in the gods and in the underlying order of the universe, that kept them moving forward, one dark day at a time, toward the light they trusted would return. When the polar night stretched across the Norse settlements, transforming 3 months into one endless evening, the Vikings didn't just survive in their longhouses. They lived. Babies were born screaming into smoky darkness. Young couples fell in love by firelight. Old warriors took their last breaths surrounded by family. And all of it happened in a space barely larger than a modern 2-car garage, packed with anywhere from 10 to 30 people who couldn't escape each other even if they wanted to. Privacy wasn't just rare during the polar night. It was physically impossible. And yet, somehow, this forced intimacy created something remarkable. A social fabric so tightly woven that it defined Viking culture for generations. Picture yourself in a northern Norwegian settlement, maybe around the Lofoten Islands where the sun disappears completely for nearly 2 months. You're sharing a longhouse with your parents, your siblings, your grandparents, your uncle's family, a few cousins, and possibly a thrall or 2 who help with the work. Everyone sleeps on raised platforms along the walls. Everyone eats around the same central fire. Everyone hears everything. When a woman went into labor during the polar night, there was no rushing to a separate birthing room or calling for privacy. The birth happened right there, often on the sleeping platform, with the entire household as witnesses. Older women in the family, those who had survived childbirth themselves, would take charge. They'd heat water over the fire, prepare clean wool for swaddling, and sometimes invoke Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, for protection. The birthing mother might grip a leather strap hung from the rafters, squatting in the traditional Norse position. Around her, life continued because it had to. Children were ushered to the far end of the house, but could still hear everything. Men might step outside briefly if the cold wasn't too brutal, but more often they simply turned their backs and focused on their work, pretending not to notice. When the baby finally arrived, the first sound it heard wasn't silence or soft music. It was the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of family voices, maybe the snort of a goat from the byre section. The infant was quickly cleaned, wrapped in wool, and passed around to be examined by firelight. Was it healthy? Would it survive the winter? These weren't casual questions. Infant mortality during the dark months was high, and every family knew the heartbreak of losing a child to the cold. If the baby seemed strong, it would be given water in a naming ceremony, usually within 9 days. The father would sprinkle water on the child and declare its name, officially welcoming it into the family and the community. This wasn't just ritual, it was practical. If the child died before naming, the grief was somehow easier to bear. They were protecting their hearts in a world where death was always close. But births during the polar night also carried a strange kind of magic. Children born in darkness were sometimes believed to have special connections to the spirit world. They were considered hardy, blessed by the gods for arriving in the harshest season. Some grew up to become seers or vulva, the wise women who could see the future. And then there was love. Young Vikings didn't stop being human just because the sun had vanished. Attraction still happened, crushes still bloomed, and couples still found ways to be together despite the complete lack of privacy. Courtship during the polar night was an exercise in creativity. A young man couldn't exactly take a girl for a romantic walk when it was -20 degrees and pitch black outside. Instead, he'd have to impress her with his skills indoors. Could he carve a beautiful comb from antler? Could he tell a story that made her laugh? Could he play the lyre well enough to make the whole longhouse quiet down and listen? Young women, for their part, showed their worth through their domestic skills. Spinning thread evenly, weaving tight cloth, cooking stew that didn't taste like leather. These weren't just chores. They were advertisements of competence. A woman who could keep a household running through the polar night was worth her weight in silver. Physical intimacy was trickier. Married couples had some advantages. They had established sleeping spots, and everyone knew to give them space when they pulled their wool curtains closed. But it was never truly private. The platforms creaked. The furs rustled. Everyone knew what was happening, and the polite fiction was to simply pretend you didn't hear anything. For unmarried couples, things were even more complicated. Sneaking off to the buyer might give you slightly more privacy, but it also meant potentially freezing to death or starting scandalous rumors that could damage reputations and marriage prospects. Some settlements had small storage buildings where young couples might steal a few minutes alone, but this was risky. Getting caught could lead to forced marriage, social shame, or worse. Interestingly, the Vikings weren't as uptight about premarital relations as later Christian societies would be. What mattered more was responsibility. If a pregnancy resulted, the man was expected to marry the woman or provide support. Children were valuable, and illegitimacy, while not ideal, wasn't the social death sentence it would become in medieval Europe. Marriages sometimes happened during the polar night, though summer was more traditional. A winter wedding was a practical affair. The couple would declare their intentions before witnesses, exchange gifts, and then essentially move from one sleeping platform to another. The celebration might involve extra food, some meat if supplies allowed, and storytelling. But the wedding night offered no more privacy than any other night. You learned to be quiet, quick, and to have a sense of humor about the whole situation. The intimacy of the longhouse meant that relationships were everyone's business. If a couple argued, the whole household heard it. If they were affectionate, people noticed. This could be suffocating, but it also meant that relationship problems rarely festered. Aunts, grandmothers, and older cousins would intervene with advice, mediation, or sometimes just blunt observations about who was being unreasonable. Domestic violence, while it existed, was harder to hide and more likely to be confronted. A man who regularly beat his wife would face pressure from other family members and might even find himself called before the thing, the local assembly, once spring arrived. The Vikings had clear laws about marriage and family conduct, and the community enforced them. Death during the polar night was perhaps the most challenging aspect of indoor life. When someone died in the darkness, you couldn't bury them. The ground was frozen solid as iron, and digging a grave was physically impossible. So the dead had to wait. Bodies were prepared immediately. They were washed, dressed in their best clothes, wrapped in furs or linen, and then moved to the coldest part of the longhouse, usually near the door or in an unused storage area. The cold acted as a natural preservative. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. The family would hold a wake, gathering around the body to tell stories about the deceased, to honor their memory, and to ensure their spirit knew it was loved and remembered, mead or ale would be poured as offerings. Personal items, weapons for men, jewelry for women, would be placed with the body. But here's the difficult part. That body stayed in the house until the ground thawed. For deaths early in the polar night, that might mean living with your deceased grandfather for 2 or 3 months. Children grew accustomed to the presence of death in a way that would shock modern sensibilities. It was simply part of life. This proximity to death had philosophical implications. The Vikings developed a matter-of-fact acceptance of mortality that shows up in their sagas and poetry. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes. It was present, visible, undeniable. This likely contributed to their famous fearlessness in battle. When you've lived with death since childhood, it loses some of its terror. When spring finally came, burial could proceed. The body would be taken to the family plot or sometimes to a boat burial if the deceased was particularly important. The long wait didn't diminish the ceremony. If anything, the delayed burial allowed for more elaborate preparations. Grave goods could be crafted, burial mounds constructed properly, and distant relatives notified. The psychological impact of sharing such intimate spaces during the polar night can't be overstated. On one hand, it created incredibly strong family bonds. You learned everything about your relatives, their strengths, their flaws, their habits. You knew who snored, who had nightmares, who got cranky when hungry, who could be counted on in a crisis. Children grew up with an intense sense of belonging. They were never alone, never unwatched, never without guidance. Multiple adults cared for them, taught them, corrected them. This collective child-rearing created resilient kids who understood their role in the larger family structure. But the lack of privacy also created tensions. Personality conflicts had nowhere to hide. If you didn't get along with someone, you still had to see them every single day for 3 months. Arguments could escalate quickly in such close quarters. The Vikings developed elaborate social codes to manage these tensions, unspoken rules about when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to step outside even if it meant freezing for a few minutes just to get a break. Humor was essential. The ability to laugh at yourself, to deflect tension with a joke, to find absurdity in the situation. This was a survival skill as important as knowing how to start a fire. The sagas are full of dry, dark humor because that's what kept people sane. Sexual frustration was real and rarely discussed in historical sources, but it must have been a factor. Young adults in their prime, stuck indoors with limited privacy, surrounded by the same people day after day. Some undoubtedly had affairs. Others channeled their energy into work, into crafts, into storytelling. The Vikings understood that idle hands and frustrated bodies could lead to trouble, so they kept everyone busy. The elderly played a crucial role during the polar night. Grandparents were living libraries, repositories of knowledge, skills, and stories. They taught crafts, shared wisdom, entertained children, and provided continuity with the past. In a culture without written books, old people were literally irreplaceable. Their death during the polar night was mourned not just emotionally but practically. What knowledge died with them? What stories would never be told again? Conflicts between in-laws were legendary. When your daughter married and moved into your longhouse with her new husband, or when your son brought home a bride, you were committing to 3 months of very close living. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law dynamics could make or break a household's peace. The sagas contain numerous stories of such conflicts, suggesting this was a common source of stress. Food disputes could trigger feuds. When resources were scarce and everyone was hungry, the distribution of food became intensely political. Who got the best piece of meat? Were the children being fed enough? Was someone sneaking extra portions? These questions could fracture families. But for all the challenges, the polar night also created moments of profound connection. A father teaching his son to carve by firelight. A grandmother braiding her granddaughter's hair while humming old songs. Siblings huddled together under furs, telling each other stories to pass the time. These quiet moments of intimacy, forced by darkness and cold, became the foundation of family identity. The concept of hygge, which modern Scandinavians celebrate, has its roots in these polar night survival strategies. Creating coziness, warmth, and fellowship in the face of darkness and cold wasn't just pleasant. It was necessary. It was the difference between a household that survived intact and one that fractured under pressure. By the time the polar night finally ended, everyone in that longhouse knew each other in ways that are almost unimaginable today. They had seen each other at their best and worst. They had weathered birth and death together. They had argued and reconciled, celebrated and mourned, all within the same smoky, crowded, impossible space. And somehow it worked. Not perfectly, not always harmoniously, but well enough that these settlements survived, generation after generation, proving that humans can adapt to almost anything as long as they have each other. After 3 months of unbroken darkness, after counting the days by notches on wood because time loses all meaning without sunrise, after starting to forget what color really looks like beyond the orange flicker of firelight, something miraculous happens. The sun returns. For the Vikings living through the polar night, this wasn't just a calendar event. It was resurrection. It was proof that the gods had not abandoned them. It was hope made visible on the southern horizon. The first signs came weeks before the actual sunrise. The Vikings were expert observers of their environment because their lives depended on it, and they knew exactly what to watch for. First, the quality of darkness changed. Around late January or early February, depending on how far north you lived, the absolute pitch black began to soften. For a few minutes each day, the southern horizon would lighten from black to deep blue, then to a dark gray. This wasn't sunlight yet. It was what meteorologists call civil twilight, that pre-dawn glow that tells you the sun is coming. Those few minutes of gray light were treasured beyond description. After months of darkness, even dim light felt like a gift from the gods. People would stop their work and simply stand outside, faces turned south, breathing in the cold air and staring at that faint glow. Children who had been born during the polar night and had never seen the sun were carried outside to witness this first lightning. Parents would point to the horizon and explain what was coming, building anticipation for something these infants couldn't yet understand. Week by week, the twilight period grew longer. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. The southern horizon would glow with deep purples, rich blues, and eventually hints of pink and orange. The stars, which had been constant companions through the dark months, began to fade earlier each day. The Vikings tracked this progression carefully. The lengthening twilight meant that the worst was over. Food stores could be assessed with more accuracy. Plans could be made. Energy levels, suppressed by months of darkness, began to rise. And then came the day that everyone had been waiting for. The day when the sun, that distant ball of fire that had abandoned them months ago, finally crept back above the horizon. This wasn't sudden. The Vikings didn't wake up to find the sun blazing overhead. Instead, on the designated day, people gathered outside in the brutal cold, wrapped in every piece of fur and wool they owned, and they waited. The southern horizon glowed brighter than it had in months. Pink and orange and gold painted the sky in colors that seemed impossibly vivid after so long in darkness. And then, slowly, almost teasingly, the very top edge of the sun appeared. Just the tiniest sliver of burning light, but it was enough. People cried. Grown warriors with scars from a dozen battles stood with tears freezing on their cheeks. Mothers held their babies up to see it. Old people who had survived countless polar nights wept like children because they had lived to see it one more time. The sun wouldn't stay long on this first day. It might only peak above the horizon for a few minutes before sinking back down. But those minutes were everything. Rituals had been prepared for this moment. Offerings were made to Sol, the goddess who drives the sun's chariot across the sky. The Vikings would pour mead or ale onto the snow, would burn valuable incense, would sacrifice animals in thanks and supplication. The message was clear. Thank you for returning. Please don't leave us again. Some settlements had traditional songs sung only at the sun's return. These were ancient chants passed down through generations, part prayer and part celebration. The words might have been in old forms of Norse that even the singers didn't fully understand, but the meaning was obvious. Welcome back. We survived. We're still here. In some communities, the eldest member would ceremonially light a new fire from flint and steel, symbolically replacing the old fire that had sustained them through the darkness. This new fire represented the sun's return and the promise of spring. Bonfires were lit, huge ones that consumed wood that had been saved specifically for this purpose. The Vikings, who had been so careful with fuel throughout the dark months, suddenly became extravagant. They wanted to match the sun's fire with their own, to to show that their inner light had never been extinguished. Dancing happened, even though the cold was severe enough to cause frostbite. People joined hands and moved in circles around the bonfires, their breath creating clouds of steam, their voices raised in songs of joy. The movements were probably traditional, passed down through countless generations, a physical expression of relief and gratitude. The feast that followed the sun's return was significant. This wasn't like the Yule feasting, which had been about endurance and hope. This was celebration. This was victory. Families brought out preserved foods they had been hoarding, the best cuts of meat, the last wheels of cheese, the remaining stores of meat. Everyone ate together. The entire settlement might gather in the largest longhouse or, if the weather permitted, around outdoor fires. Social barriers dissolved. The wealthy shared with the poor. Old feuds were set aside. On this day, everyone was equal in their gratitude to still be alive. Stories were exchanged about the dark months. Who had been born? Who had died? What had been accomplished? These stories became part of the community's oral history, woven into the larger narrative of survival. Children played games in the strange, returning light. After months of being confined indoors, they ran wild, chasing each other through the snow, their laughter carrying across the frozen landscape. Parents let them, understanding that this release of pent-up energy was necessary and healthy. The sun's return also had practical implications. With light came the ability to assess what had survived the polar night and what needed attention. Damaged roofs could be properly examined and repairs planned. Storage areas could be inventoried. The condition of livestock could be checked in real light rather than by firelight and touch. Some animals would have died during the dark months, their bodies frozen and preserved in outbuildings. Others would be weak and in need of extra care. The sea ice could be evaluated. Was it stable enough to walk on? Were there seals to hunt? Could fishing resume? The Vikings were maritime people, and 3 months away from the ocean was 3 months away from their primary food source. Hunting parties could begin to organize. Arctic hares, ptarmigan, and eventually reindeer would be moving through the landscape. With daylight, tracking became possible again. Fresh meat, after months of preserved food, would be desperately welcome. But the sun's return also revealed harsh truths. How much food remained? Would it be enough to last until proper spring arrived and farming could resume? Every household had to do this calculation, and for some, the math was frightening. This is when communities prove their worth. Families with surplus shared with families in need, not out of pure altruism, but because next year, the situations might be reversed. The Vikings understood reciprocity. Help given would be help returned. The lengthening days brought energy, but also exhaustion. Bodies that had adapted to darkness and minimal activity now had to readjust. The sun's light disrupted sleep patterns that had been 3 months in the making. People found themselves simultaneously energized and tired. Children, especially, struggled with the transition. Toddlers who had spent most of their conscious lives in darkness sometimes cried or acted fearful in bright sunlight. Parents had to coax them, gradually exposing them to longer periods of light until their eyes and nervous systems adjusted. The psychological impact of the sun's return was profound. Depression that had settled over some people like a heavy blanket began to lift. Energy returned. Hope felt justified rather than desperate. The dark thoughts that accompany prolonged darkness, the wondering if spring would ever come, if life would ever feel normal again, all of it eased with the growing light. But not everyone recovered immediately. Some people, particularly the elderly or those who had been sick during the polar night, remained lethargic. The Vikings understood that the darkness could leave scars on the mind that took time to heal. As the days progressed and the sun stayed above the horizon for longer periods, life accelerated. By late February or early March, depending on location, there might be several hours of sunlight each day. This was enough to resume normal activities. Tools that had been repaired indoors during the polar night could now be tested. Boats stored for the winter could be examined for damage. Ice fishing became possible, and then, as the days lengthened further, real fishing. The women who had spent 3 months in smoky dimness working on textile production could now see the true quality of their work. Mistakes became obvious in daylight. Pride was taken in the work that had been done blind or nearly so. Young men, cooped up for months, became restless and energetic. This was when raiding parties began to be discussed and planned. By late spring, when the seas became navigable, they would be ready. The polar night had forced them to rest, but now their warrior energy needed an outlet. The sun's return also marked the beginning of the agricultural countdown. Fields needed to be prepared. Seeds needed to be checked. Plans needed to be made. The growing season in the far north was brutally short, and every day mattered. Religious significance was woven through all of this. The Vikings believed that the sun's return was not automatic or guaranteed. It had to be earned through right living, through proper sacrifices, through maintaining good relationships with the gods. The fact that it had returned meant they had done something right. Volva, the wise women, might perform divination rituals to predict what the coming year would bring. Would it be a good harvest? Would the fishing be plentiful? Would raids be successful? The sun's return was the perfect time for such prophecies because it represented a new beginning. Some Vikings believed that the sun's return also meant the gates between worlds became less permeable. The spirits, trolls, and Draugr that roamed freely during the darkness returned to their own realms. The world became safer, more ordered, more knowable. As February turned to March and March to April, the change became dramatic. The sun that had only appeared briefly now stayed above the horizon for many hours. By late April or early May, depending on how far north you were, the sun wouldn't set at all. The polar night would give way to the midnight sun, and the Vikings would experience the opposite extreme, constant daylight. But they never forgot the darkness. Every person who had survived a polar night carried it with them. They knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the darkness would return. Next October or November, the sun would disappear again. This knowledge shaped everything. It made them appreciate light while they had it. It made them work harder during the long summer days because they knew winter was always coming. It made them value their communities because they knew they would need each other again when the darkness returned. The sun's return was never taken for granted. Every year it came back felt like a miracle. Every year it stayed a little longer felt like a blessing. And every person who had survived the polar night became stronger, tougher, more capable. They had faced the ultimate test. They had lived through endless darkness, brutal cold, and crushing isolation. They had maintained their humanity, their families, and their culture through it all. And when the sun finally returned, they celebrated not just the light, but their own resilience. They had won. Again, the polar night didn't just test the Vikings. It forged them. Those 3 months of absolute darkness, of survival against odds that would have broken lesser peoples, created a culture with a specific set of values, beliefs, and characteristics that persisted long after individual polar nights ended. To understand the Vikings, to really grasp what made them who they were, you have to understand what it means to live through sustained darkness and come out the other side intact. Let's start with something fundamental. The Vikings had no illusions about the world being fair, comfortable, or designed for human happiness. They knew, with certainty, that nature was indifferent to their survival. The polar night taught this lesson every single year. This created a mindset that modern people often misunderstand. The Vikings weren't nihilistic or depressed. They were realistic. They accepted hardship as the default state of existence and treated comfort as a temporary gift to be appreciated, not an entitlement to be demanded. This shows up everywhere in Norse culture. The sagas are full of characters who face terrible odds with calm acceptance. They don't whine. They don't ask, why me? They assess the situation, make the best decision possible, and then deal with the consequences without complaint. This isn't stoicism in the Greek philosophical sense. It's something colder and more practical. It's the mindset of people who have spent 3 months in darkness and know that complaining doesn't make the sun rise any faster. Action matters. Adaptation matters. Your feelings about the situation are irrelevant. The polar night also taught the Vikings about community in ways that shaped their entire social structure. You cannot survive extended darkness alone. This was not theoretical or philosophical. It was literal truth. As a result, Norse society placed enormous value on reciprocity and social bonds. The concept of hospitality was sacred. A traveler seeking shelter must be taken in, fed, and protected. Why? Because next year, you might be the traveler. Next winter, you might need someone else's fire to survive. This created a web of obligations and relationships that extended across entire regions. You helped your neighbors not because you liked them, though you might, but because your survival was tied to theirs. The Viking Age laws and social codes reflect this. Many of the worst crimes were those that broke communal bonds, oath-breaking, betrayal, refusing hospitality to travelers. The Thing, the assembly where disputes were resolved and laws made, was a direct result of this understanding. Communities had to function smoothly because dysfunction during the polar night could kill everyone. The Thing provided a structured way to maintain social order without resorting to constant violence. The polar night also shaped Norse attitudes toward death. When you've lived with death, literally in your home for months at a time, it loses its power to terrify. Death became a fact to be acknowledged and prepared for rather than something to be feared or hidden. This explains a lot about Viking funeral practices. The elaborate ship burials, the grave goods, the burial mounds, all of it reflects a culture that thought seriously about death and wanted to honor it properly. But it also explains their fearlessness in battle. Berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought with seemingly supernatural fury, weren't mythical. They were real, and they had a psychological advantage. When you've seen your grandfather's body frozen in the corner of the longhouse for 2 months, when you've helped wash your sister who died in childbirth, when death is familiar rather than foreign, you don't freeze in combat. You act. This doesn't mean the Vikings didn't value life. They did intensely. But they didn't cling to it with the desperate fear that characterizes cultures where death is hidden away and never discussed. Life was precious precisely because it was fragile and temporary. The polar night also created a specific relationship with time. For 3 months, there was no sunrise to mark the beginning of a day, no sunset to mark its end. Time became flexible, measured by the fire's needs rather than the sun's position. This influenced how Vikings thought about past, present, and future. The sagas, their epic oral histories, blend all 3 time frames constantly. Prophecy and memory are given equal weight with current events. This might seem strange until you realize it comes from a culture where time itself became negotiable during the polar night. The concept of WIRD, often translated as fate, but really meaning something more like the web of cause and effect, comes from this temporal fluidity. Your actions today create the conditions for tomorrow, just as yesterday's actions created today. During the polar night, this became obvious. The preparations you made in autumn determined whether you survived until spring. Technologically, the polar night pushed innovation. The Vikings became masters of fire making, of fuel efficiency, of insulation, of food preservation, of indoor crafts, all because they had to. 3 months without access to fresh food or outdoor work meant they had to develop alternative methods for everything. This innovative mindset extended to their seafaring. The ships that carried Vikings across the Atlantic and down to the Mediterranean were products of a culture that understood adaptation and efficiency. When you've solved the problem of keeping 30 people alive in a smoke-filled longhouse for 3 months, designing a ship that can cross an ocean becomes just another engineering challenge. The polar night shaped Norse art and aesthetics in subtle ways. The intricate carvings, the complex knotwork patterns, the detailed jewelry, all of this work was done by firelight during long, dark nights. The art had to be tactile as well as visual because you often created it by touch and limited light. Norse music, the haunting chants and saga recitations, developed to carry in smoke-filled spaces and compete with the crackling fire. The rhythms are hypnotic, designed to hold attention during long, dark evenings when boredom was a real danger. Their storytelling tradition, the sagas that preserve so much of their culture, came directly from the polar night. When you can't work outside and you need to keep people entertained and sane, you tell stories. You develop your verbal skills. You learn what narratives hold attention and which ones lose it. This oral tradition created a culture with phenomenal memory. Without writing, everything important had to be remembered and passed down verbally. Children learned poems hundreds of lines long. Legal codes were memorized. Genealogies stretching back generations were recited at gatherings. The polar night also influenced Norse religion in profound ways. The gods themselves reflected the harsh reality of survival. Odin wasn't a loving father figure. He was a god of knowledge gained through suffering, who hanged himself on a tree for 9 days to gain wisdom. Thor fought constantly against giants who represented chaos and destruction. Freyr controlled fertility and harvest. These weren't distant, abstract deities. They were forces tied directly to survival. The concept of Ragnarok, the end of the world, includes Fimbulwinter, 3 years of endless winter before the final battle. This wasn't random imagery. It was an extrapolation of the polar night. The Vikings knew what extended darkness and cold could do. They imagined it continuing forever and recognized it as apocalyptic. Yule, celebrated during the darkest part of the polar night, was originally a festival to encourage the sun's return and honor the gods of winter. Modern Christmas traditions like evergreen trees, Yule logs, feasting, and gift-giving all come from these ancient practices. The Vikings were trying to bring light, joy, and hope into the darkest time of year. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The legacy of the polar night didn't end when the Viking Age ended. It's still visible in modern Scandinavia. Nordic countries consistently rank among the happiest in the world despite long, dark winters. Why? Because they've inherited cultural strategies for dealing with darkness and cold that work. Hygge in Denmark, Koselig in Norway, Lagom in Sweden, these concepts of coziness, balance, and creating warmth in darkness come directly from their Viking ancestors. The Nordic welfare state, with its emphasis on collective support and shared resources, reflects the same values that kept Viking settlements alive during the polar night. You take care of everyone because everyone's survival is interconnected. Nordic design, famous for being functional, minimalist, and focused on creating light-filled spaces, is a direct response to living in a place where darkness dominates half the year. Every window is designed to capture maximum light. Every interior is painted in light colors to reflect and amplify what little light exists. The famous Nordic work-life balance, the shorter workdays and longer vacations, comes from a culture that understands seasonal rhythms. You work intensely when conditions allow and rest when they don't. You don't fight nature. You adapt to it. Even Nordic stoicism, the tendency toward emotional reserve and understated communication, has roots in the polar night. When you're trapped in close quarters for months, you learn to control your emotions, to speak carefully, to avoid conflicts that could spiral out of control. But there's also warmth underneath that reserve. Nordic cultures are famous for strong social safety nets, high trust, and taking care of their own. That's the legacy of people who know they need each other to survive. The environmental movement in Nordic countries is partly rooted in this heritage too. When you've lived in darkness, you appreciate light. When you face the power of nature directly, you respect it. The Vikings didn't see themselves as separate from nature or above it. They saw themselves as part of it, subject to its rules and cycles. This created an attitude toward the environment that's different from cultures that try to dominate or control nature. You don't fight the polar night. You prepare for it, adapt to it, and wait for it to pass. Modern environmental policies in Scandinavia reflect this acceptance of natural limits. The Viking legacy also shows up in attitudes toward challenge and discomfort. Nordic countries embrace winter sports, outdoor activities in harsh conditions, and generally don't let cold weather stop them from living their lives. Children in Norway play outside in sub-zero temperatures. Swedish preschools have outdoor time regardless of weather. This isn't masochism. It's the inherited understanding that discomfort won't kill you, and avoiding all challenges makes you weaker. There's a saying in Norwegian, Det finnes ikke dårlig vær, bare dårlig klær. There is no bad weather, only bad clothing. This is pure Viking philosophy. The problem isn't the conditions. The problem is your preparation. Control what you can control and accept what you can't. The polar night also taught resilience through repetition. Every year, the darkness came. Every year, you survived it. This created confidence rooted in experience. You knew you could endure because you had endured before. This is the opposite of modern cultures that try to eliminate all hardship and then are shocked when difficulties arise. The Vikings expected hardship. They prepared for it. And when it arrived, they had the skills and mindset to handle it. This made them formidable as warriors, traders, explorers, and settlers. They could go anywhere and survive anything because nothing they encountered could be worse than the polar night. When Vikings settled Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, they brought this mindset with them. These weren't tropical paradises. They were harsh, challenging environments. But to people who regularly survived 3 months of darkness, a new land was just another problem to solve. The Icelandic settlement is particularly remarkable. Nearly every winter in early Iceland was life-threatening. Yet the society that developed there created Europe's first parliament, produced an incredible literary tradition, and has survived for over 1,000 years. That's the Polar Night legacy in action. Even the Viking raids, which they're most famous for, were partly influenced by the Polar Night. After months cooped up indoors, young men needed an outlet for their energy. Raiding provided that outlet, while also bringing back resources that made the next Polar Night easier to survive. Today, when climate scientists talk about human adaptation to extreme environments, they often point to the Arctic peoples as examples. The Vikings, along with the Sami and Inuit, prove that humans can thrive even in conditions that seem impossible. As climate change accelerates and the world faces new challenges, there's something to learn from the Viking approach. They didn't deny the reality of their situation. They didn't pretend the Polar Night wouldn't come or that it would be easy. They prepared, they adapted, they supported each other, and they survived. The Polar Night created a culture that valued preparation over panic, community over individualism, adaptation over resistance, resilience over comfort, reality over illusion, action over complaining, long-term thinking over short-term gratification. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're survival strategies that remain relevant. The Vikings who endured the Polar Night weren't superhuman. They were people facing impossible conditions who chose to survive anyway. They did it through practical skills, social cooperation, mental toughness, and cultural practices passed down through generations. Every time the sun disappeared, they proved that humans can endure almost anything if they have the right mindset, the right community, and the right preparation. Every time the sun returned, they proved that darkness, no matter how complete, is temporary. That's the legacy of the long night. Not that humans can't be broken, but that they can choose not to break. That community makes you stronger than any individual could be alone. That preparation matters more than power. That acceptance of reality is more useful than denial. That hope, earned through effort rather than given freely, is the most durable kind. When modern people look at the Vikings, they often focus on the violence, the raids, the conquest. But the real Viking achievement wasn't what they destroyed. It was what they built and maintained in the face of conditions that should have destroyed them. They built societies that lasted. They created art that survived. They told stories that still resonate. They raised children who became adults capable of facing their own challenges. And they did all of this while dealing with an environmental obstacle, the Polar Night, that would have broken cultures less prepared to handle it. The Norse sagas contain a concept called Inningard and Utangard, literally, inside the yard and outside the yard. Inningard was the safe, ordered world of home, community, and civilization. Utangard was the wild, chaotic, dangerous world beyond. The Polar Night blurred this line. For 3 months, even inside your home, you were in Utangard. Chaos could enter at any moment. Safety was never guaranteed. This created a specific kind of vigilance and awareness. You couldn't relax completely, even in your own space. But you also learned to find moments of peace within the chaos. You learned to create inner calm when external calm was impossible. Modern psychology talks about stress inoculation, the idea that exposure to manageable stress makes you better at handling future stress. The Polar Night was the ultimate stress inoculation. Children who grew up surviving it were prepared for almost anything life could throw at them later. This might explain Viking success in so many different environments. Norse traders operated from Russia to Constantinople. Viking mercenaries served Byzantine emperors. Norse settlers established communities from North America to Sicily. How did they adapt so successfully to such different places? Because they had been trained from childhood to adapt to the impossible. 3 months of darkness taught flexibility, creativity, and resilience in ways that comfortable childhoods never could. When you've learned to thrive in darkness, learning to thrive in a new culture or climate is just another adaptation challenge. The Polar Night also created a specific relationship with hope. In cultures with predictable sunrises, hope can be passive. You wait for things to get better. But during the Polar Night, hope had to be active. You didn't wait for the sun to return. You survived until it returned. Hope was something you maintained through effort, through ritual, through community support. This active hope shows up in Norse mythology. The gods aren't all-powerful. They're strong and wise, but they can fail, suffer, and die. Yet they keep fighting against the giants, against chaos, against the inevitable end. They know Ragnarok is coming, that the world will end in ice and fire, but they fight anyway. That's polar night philosophy. You know winter is coming, you know it will be hard, but you prepare and you fight and you survive anyway. The concept of hamingja, often translated as luck, but really meaning something closer to earned fortune through right action and ancestral backing, comes from this worldview. Good things don't just happen to you. You create the conditions for good things through preparation, through maintaining good relationships, through honoring your ancestors and gods. During the polar night, this was literally true. Your survival depended on your preparation. Your harvest in autumn determined your survival through winter. Your relationships with your community determined whether anyone would help you if you ran short of food. Your ancestors' knowledge, passed down through stories and skills, gave you the tools to survive. The Vikings also understood cyclical time in a way that modern linear time cultures often don't. The sun left and returned. Winter came and went. The wheel turned. Nothing was permanent, good or bad. This prevented both despair in hard times and complacency in good times. After surviving a polar night, you knew spring would come because it always had. But you also knew that next winter would come too, so you didn't waste the good weather. This created a culture that worked when conditions allowed and rested when they didn't, but always with an eye toward the future. This is why the Vikings were such effective traders and planners. They thought in terms of seasons and years, not just days or weeks. They understood deferred gratification because they had to store food in autumn to survive winter. They understood investment because time and effort spent on preparation paid dividends months later. The polar night even influenced Norse concepts of courage. Bravery wasn't about being unafraid. The sagas acknowledged that heroes feel fear. Courage was about acting despite fear, about doing what needed to be done regardless of your feelings. When you're in your third month of darkness, when your food is running low, when your child is sick, when you're not sure you'll survive until spring, you don't have the luxury of waiting until you feel brave. You do what needs to be done. You feed the fire. You ration the food. You care for the sick. You keep going. This practical courage, divorced from emotional state, made Vikings effective in crisis situations. They didn't need to feel confident or comfortable to act. They had been trained by the polar night to function regardless of their feelings. The legacy shows up in surprising places. The concept of sisu in Finland, though Finnish culture is distinct from Norse culture, comes from a similar environmental pressure. Sisu means something like stubborn perseverance beyond reason, and it developed in response to the same kind of harsh northern conditions that shaped the Vikings. When Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen became the first person to reach the South Pole in 1911, he attributed his success partly to his Norwegian heritage and understanding of polar conditions. His team survived while Scott's British expedition perished, partly because Amundsen approached the challenge with a Viking mindset: careful preparation, realistic planning, adaptation to conditions, and acceptance of hardship as normal rather than tragic. Modern military forces study Viking tactics and psychology. The Norwegian military trains in extreme cold specifically to maintain that cultural connection to their ancestors' capabilities. They understand that the mental edge provided by cold weather expertise and acceptance of hardship can be as important as technology or numbers. The polar night legacy also appears in Nordic approaches to mental health. These cultures acknowledge that seasonal depression is real and normal. They don't pathologize it or treat it as a personal failing. Instead, they have cultural strategies for managing it: light therapy, social gatherings, maintaining routines, staying active. This acceptance and management approach is pure polar night thinking. You can't stop the darkness from coming, but you can prepare for it. You can't eliminate all discomfort, but you can minimize it through smart strategies. You can't do it alone, but with community support, you can get through. Even Nordic cuisine reflects the polar night. The emphasis on preserved foods, fermented fish, dried meats, root vegetables, these all come from cultures that had to store food for months of darkness. The dishes might seem strange to outsiders, but they represent thousands of years of refinement in food preservation techniques. Lutefisk, that notorious dried fish soaked in lye that many non-Norwegians find inedible, was a survival food. It could be stored almost indefinitely, and provided protein during the polar night. No, it doesn't taste great, but it kept people alive, and there's cultural pride in eating what your ancestors ate to survive. The Viking influence on language is another legacy. English words like husband, from Old Norse husbandi, house dweller, window, from Vindaga, wind-eye, law, skill, egg, sky, and hundreds of others come from Old Norse. These weren't just borrowed words. They were concepts so fundamental that English absorbed them completely. Many of these words relate to home, survival, and community. Hearth, home, loan, trust, fellow, all from Old Norse, all related to the kinds of social bonds necessary to survive the polar night. The genetic legacy is interesting too. Modern Scandinavians show adaptations to low-light conditions, including higher rates of light-colored eyes and hair that may help with light absorption and vitamin D production. These aren't Viking-specific, they're broader Northern European adaptations, but the Vikings carried these genes to new places. More than genetics, though, the Vikings passed down epigenetic and cultural adaptations. Children raised with polar night survival strategies, even if they later lived in milder climates, passed those strategies to their children. The mindset persisted even when the environmental pressure eased. This is why Norse-descended populations in North America, particularly in the upper Midwest, maintained cultural characteristics around stoicism, self-reliance, and community cooperation even generations after immigration. The polar night legacy was carried in stories, values, and practices, not just genes. When we talk about Viking exploration and expansion, we often frame it as conquest or adventure. But in many ways, it was the polar night pushing them outward. Populations that could survive 3 months of darkness could grow beyond what the local resources could support during winter. Expansion wasn't just ambition. It was pressure release. Young people who had survived multiple polar nights were tough, skilled, and looking for opportunities. Sailing to new lands wasn't crazy. It was another adaptation challenge, and they had been trained since childhood to handle adaptation challenges. The Viking Age ended around 1100 CE when Scandinavian kingdoms converted to Christianity and integrated more fully into European political structures. But the polar night didn't end. Every winter, it still came. Every year, people still had to survive it. The difference was that survival strategies became more sophisticated over time. Better building techniques, better food storage, eventually trade networks that could supply winter food from outside the region. The fundamental challenge remained, but the tools to address it improved. Yet the cultural imprint of those early generations who survived with minimal technology remained. It's still there today in how Nordic cultures approach problems, build communities, and understand their relationship with nature. There's a reason that when people study human resilience, adaptation to extreme environments, sustainable living, work-life balance, social cooperation, or mental health in challenging conditions, they often end up looking at Nordic countries. These societies, shaped by the polar night, develop strategies that work. The ultimate legacy of the long night isn't just that humans survived it. It's that they survived it in a way that made them stronger, more innovative, more cooperative, and more capable. They turned an environment that should have killed them into a teacher that made them formidable. Every child who survived their first polar night learned that they were tougher than they thought. Every adult who survived another one learned that preparation and community were more valuable than individual strength. Every elder who had survived dozens learned that cycles turn, darkness passes, and survival is always possible if you don't give up. That's the real legacy. Not horned helmets or dragon ships or raids on monasteries. Those are the flashy parts, the parts that make good movies and video games. The real legacy is the quiet knowledge, passed down through generations, that humans can endure anything if they stick together, prepare properly, and refuse to quit. The Vikings who sat in smoky longhouses during the polar night, who gave birth in darkness, who died and waited frozen until spring, who told stories and made tools and fed fires and kept going day after day after day, they left us something more valuable than treasure. They left us proof. Proof that darkness is temporary. Proof that community matters more than comfort. Proof that preparation beats panic. Proof that humans, when properly motivated and organized, can survive almost anything. And proof that the sun always returns. Always. You just have to survive until it does. That's the legacy of the long night. And it's still teaching us, still shaping cultures, still reminding us what humans are capable of when they refuse to let impossible conditions define their limits. The polar night came every year. The Vikings survived every year. And in doing so, they showed the rest of humanity what resilience really looks like. Not flashy, not loud, not dramatic, just endurance, just preparation, just community, just lighting the fire, day after day, until the sun remembers to return. And when it does, celebrating not because you're special, but because you did what needed to be done. That's Viking legacy. That's the gift of the long night. And it's still here, still relevant, still teaching anyone willing to learn. Because darkness always comes, but the sun always returns. You just have to survive until it does.